All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to EQ Day, the first ever EQ Day to celebrate the launch of the Audio Issues EQ that many of you already have in your DAW. And I'm super thankful, grateful, and appreciate your support in every way. Love that you're loving it. And we're going to celebrate today by talking about EQ for 3 hours. I don't really know. Maybe that was a crazy idea, but here we are, and we're gonna do it. And it's an exhaustive subject that we can talk about forever. It's what my audience has always loved to know more about, which is why I've have my training programs in EQ now on equalization, because it's such a great tool and it's such a important processor to master when you're mixing or recording or mastering your music, making your music in any way. So we have lots of people already here from everywhere, but let's first say hi to the man of the hour, Mr. Chris Selim of Mixdown Online. Thank you so much for coming, Chris.
Hey, thanks for the invite, Björkvin.
Yeah,
very, very happy to be here with you.
Awesome. Yeah, it's gonna be a fun hour. So how this is gonna work? We're gonna go through questions. We're gonna talk about EQ. I have some questions here in front of me from the audience that already submitted, but do feel free to ask any questions in the chat. We'll try to get through as many as possible. And on the half hour, we're gonna have a new guest. So next up is at 1:30, we'll have Shepard of Production Advice and Mastering Media and meter plugs. He has some audio plugins out there too for mastering. You can actually get them in the if you're watching on YouTube, they're in the description as well. Love those plugins, use them all the time. And after Ian, we have Lid Shaw of Recording Studio Rockstars. We have worked together in the past. We did a few Bonnaroo years together where we recorded, mixed, and mastered lots of songs in the Bonnaroo Haybill studio, but we'll talk about that later. Let's say hi to the audience. David Dunn is here. Happy EQ Day to you too.
Yeah, Thomas is here. Is one of my students. Same for who else? Who else? Yeah, Gregory also is here.
Cool. Philly. Evening, all sunny Phoenix, Arizona. That's just up the street from me. And then Columbia, South Carolina, Albuquerque, New Mexico, David Bellinger, from the Twin Cities of Minnesota, Mr. Dollar. Nice. That's a cool name. I hope that is his real name. I used to live in Minneapolis, actually, when I was a child, so I have good memories from there. Hello from Sweden, Central Pennsylvania, Boston, Argentina, Germany, Sacramento, all over the place. I love my international audience, and I'm grateful for you all to spend time with us today.
Anyone from Quebec? Let me know.
Yeah. I was actually playing some VR shooters, Population 1 yesterday with 2 people from Quebec, and they switched back and forth from French to English.
That's cool. That's what we do.
Exactly. So before we get into questions, Chris, tell us a little bit about yourself, Mixdown Online, and your career as an audio engineer in general, for those of the audience that don't know you.
Yeah, I run the YouTube channel Mixdown Online. I've been running that channel for a few years, like maybe 5 years or so. Prior to that, I worked in my home studio as a music producer, mixing engineer since 2003 on a full-time basis, recording bands, artists, a bunch of albums, working in the Christian music French industry for years. And here I am teaching on YouTube, making courses. I guess I'm the Cubase guy on one of the Cubase guys on YouTube, which is my DAW of choice. I've been working with Cubase since day one, and I'm still in love with that DAW. So that's cool. Me.
Yeah, you're the Cubase ninja.
I guess so.
Yeah. I would do Logic courses if I wasn't just so bad at Logic.
Fair enough.
But yeah, one fun story is I've actually been to Chris's house, the studio that he's sitting in there. It's in the basement. It's a beautiful studio that he has going on there. But you are moving, correct?
It's yeah, I didn't tell anyone yet, but it's in the
Oh, sorry.
plans. It's
Uh-oh.
no worries, but now it's a scoop. Yeah, it's going to come it's sometime in 2022. It's our big plan. And yeah, I'm going to keep the location for myself for now,
Okay.
to keep a bit of secrecy and curiosity.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Totally.
it's going to come in 2022. It's going to be exciting.
Cool.
It's going to be a challenge, but it's going to be fun.
Awesome.
Especially setting up a new place and stuff. So
Yeah,
it's
totally.
going to be cool.
Yeah, I went over to your house the other year. There's actually a real fun video of that on your YouTube channel where we recorded and made it. Well, we created a song in a day, and there's a fun vlog about my stay in your studio. So for those interested in that, check it out.
Oh yeah, we had a really good time. I remember that time was so fun. You happened to be in Montreal with your wife, and we just took advantage of the situation to work together and just create a kind of a sort of a challenge to do a quick production in a day. Which was pretty cool.
Totally, yeah. It was a really fun challenge.
We have Denis Beaupré from Montreal, so I have someone from Quebec here.
All right,
a couple. Glenn Klump, he lives across the river from Quebec. He's probably from Ottawa, which is my hometown. I was born in Ottawa, so
cool.
Good to see you, Greg.
Yeah. All right. Should we get into some questions?
Might as well.
Cool. So I have a few here, but like I said earlier, feel free to chime in with any questions you have. We were talking about DAWs, and the first question here on top is a DAW question. And it's about Audacity. So he says, I have Audacity. Some call it a mini DAW, some call it an audio editor. I tend to call it an audio editor, actually. And I'm wondering if it's going to be sufficient to learn the concepts in your books. Well, I guess in my books. It has multi-track recording capabilities, most of the effects, no saturation, lacks some other basics. Is there I like Audacity, I don't know it will be good enough in the long run. I find Ableton to be more thorough, but of very limited usefulness because he doesn't do the sort of tracks or the types of genres that Ableton is known for. So basically, do I have a usable platform in Audacity, or do I need to slap down some cash for a proper DAW? I just want to get the maximum benefits from your book. So he's talking about probably step-by-step mixing, EQ strategies, which is included with the EQ. But just to answer the question quickly, I think Audacity is a very limited tool. It can work well, and some people do use it, but I highly do recommend a quote-unquote real DAW that does all the nuts and bolts that you need it to do. So I use Logic. I love it. I started using Logic out of audio school, used Pro Tools before then, and then just kind of never went back. And you use Cubase. Why do you use Cubase?
Why do I use Cubase? I started on Cubase. Before I started to do music production, I played in a band, and the lead singer was taking care of recording our demos. He had his own studio, and he was working with Cubase VST back then. Okay. And that was back in 1997. And this is when I was first introduced to a DAW and the concept of the home studio, which was pretty new at the time. So when I studied music production, I studied on Digital Performer, Pro Tools, but everyone back then had a cracked version of Cubase. Okay. So I was the same. I had my version, and right after I finished production school, I bought a license right away, and I just decided to go with Cubase.
Got it. Cool. Yeah, I find I think DAW conversations, like whose DAW is better, is just totally like dumb. I think because it's the best DAW is the one that you can use well, the one that you know the best, and does the things that you want to achieve with it. There's going to be a learning curve on all DAWs, and it really just matters most about, you know, what all DAWs mostly do similar things. However, depending on the genre of music you work in or the type of things that you want to achieve, uh, some DAWs might be better suited for that. Not that they're better,
Exactly.
but they're better suited for specific scenarios. Like Logic has lots of virtual instruments, synths, the drummer, and all this sort of stuff, and it's like easy to do singer-songwriter demos in Logic. Cubase is super robust in almost in every way. FL Studio and Ableton is maybe more for the electronica beats guys, maybe some hip hop in there too. So, and Pro Tools the same is I don't even know if I should call it the industry standard anymore, but it is what the big studios use, and it's a perfectly acceptable DAW as well, of course.
Yeah, great for mixing also. Like I mixed a few albums on Pro Tools,
Right.
and I enjoyed it. You know, recording was something else because I'm so used to the way you do things in Cubase. But yeah, you're right. It's a matter of preference. It's a personal choice. As far as you know your DAW and the tools you work with to produce music and mix music, that's the one that works for you. You just go with it, and that's it.
Yeah, exactly. Got a question here. What do you think about GarageBand? So I think GarageBand is fine, but I use the big brother. Logic Pro is the big brother of GarageBand. So once you've sort of exhausted the limitations of GarageBand as a home studio musician, bedroom producer, it makes logical sense, haha, no pun intended, to change to Logic, because you know you can open up all your GarageBand sessions in Logic, and like the user interface is similar in that way. It's just more extensive. So yeah, let's. So I think that's enough about DAWs. Another question here. I've recently struggled getting my instruments, such as my synths and pads, to sound warm in the mids and high mids without clashing with my hats and drums. They tend to sound thin and lack the warmth I need. What am I doing wrong? What do you think, Chris?
It depends on the sound. Like this is like, especially with synths. Are you talking more about a pad or a lead synth, or depending on the tone of that synth? You know, a synth can be muddy, can be can also be very perky and high midi. You know, it depends on the synth you're referring to.
Right.
So it's hard to answer that question in that way.
Sure.
What I tend to do with synths, usually on a general, if we're talking about like a regular pad, a pad is going to take a lot of space, as far as, especially with frequencies, you know, in the low mid registry,
Yeah.
you know, mid to low mids, it's going to live there, you know, for the most part. So if you have problems with, you know, the transparency of your synth with your drums, on my end I do scoop a bit of the 250 to 500 hertz, just to just give a bit more space to the mids,
Right.
to the mix,
Right.
and that is going to make your drums maybe shine better again, and that depends on the drum sound also.
Right.
It's a
Right.
relationship type of thing, you know. But the first question I'm going to ask myself is, okay, am I working with the right synth sound
Sure.
to begin with?
Yeah. I mean, sound selection and to a certain another extent, arrangement is very important to making things fit before you even start EQing or doing anything of that nature. For warmth, I like saturation to add extra warmth. I don't necessarily like boost a bunch of frequencies. I like to add it maybe because saturation adds harmonics, so it sort of duplicates the frequencies that are already there in such a way, I don't know, to mathematically in that sort of way, but that usually tends to add that extra warmth that I need. If you're trying to get it to sit with the drums, if one drums is a pretty broad term, but let's say the kick especially, maybe that pad doesn't need all that low end, so the kick can come through, so you can high pass filter maybe even higher than you would think, and it will still stay relatively thick, because you can add that warmth in like 150 200 area, and and cut the stuff below it, and it might still sound warm, especially if you also have a bass guitar that's sort of holding down the fort there in the bottom of the mix. Yeah, and then the hats, it's the same sort of thing, but opposite is you want to see where your hats are like predominant. You can use a frequency analyzer for this because it's easy to see. So one is built into the EQ. But what I tend to do is I carve out sort of frequency pockets in certain areas. So I will see where the hats are frequency area wise, where they're like most predominant, and then I will boost around there in the synth or in the instrument that I'm trying to separate away until that instrument is really in the way of the hats in this case, and that's when I know that's the area that I need to cut and sort of create a pocket for those hats to live in. And if you do it, if you don't usually need to carve out a ton to just make that little pocket in that little room. So,
and warmness, talking about that, if we work with tape machines, plugins, we have to say that it sounds warmer,
right?
Basically, because for the most part, it adds a kind of a low pass filter, naturally with tape.
Right.
Depending on the IPS setting, that also adds. It adds perspective of warmness, basically,
right?
By cutting up the top end,
right? If it has like the negative space, so like you can boost the lows, and you'll add lows, but relatively, if you cut the highs, you're actually that track ends up having more of those lows, and then you actually can just increase the volume of that track and it will have more lows.
Exactly.
Taking that out. So yeah. Let's see from the audience here. Should drum loops be compressed? This is a good question. Because what's your stance on loops in general? Because oftentimes they come pretty pre-mixed.
That's the thing, usually they do. That doesn't stop me to add more compression if needed.
Right.
Most of the time, if I do so, it's not to control the dynamics. It's more to add tone or add a kind of a special effect to that loop, mainly,
Yeah.
But to add compression to control the dynamics of a drum loop, I don't know. I'm not sure. I would do it for that purpose.
Right. And then, if it sounds pretty good on its own, but it might be, if it gets lost in the mix, some parallel compression would work really well. You add
Definitely.
that. You're not squeezing the sound that the loop creator made, but you are adding to it by adding it in parallel.
Yeah, you're adding loudness, basically. So that helps.
Right. I got a couple here. And Song Seed says, been working on trying to get more transparency in my mixes. In other words, less muddiness. I began to notice the thinning out low mids start getting me there, but I'm having a hard time figuring out exactly what things to thin out. Can't cut out everything down there. Then also wondering if there are other ways to get more transparency besides cutting low mids. Yeah. So what's your plan of attack for muddiness?
It depends on the instruments. Usually, on a acoustic instrument mix where you have acoustic guitars, guitar amps, bass, drums, acoustic drums, I'm going to find a lot of muddiness on pianos. That can happen. Drums, like snare, kick can have a bit of muddiness. Also, electric guitars sometimes. There's some, even like, I remember a mix that I worked on. I was working on the mix bus. I was like at the end of the mix, but there was just something that was kind of sounded muddy on the full mix. And by just cutting out some 250 on the mix bus, cleared that up. However, I didn't want to end up there. I didn't want to do that move. I want to find what was the problem. So, okay, I knew the problem was at that area. Then I removed that EQ and went to my instrument buses.
Right.
Found out that, okay, the guitars were the problem. And then turned that off on the instrument guitar group. And then I found that exact guitar track where the problem was occurring, and by cutting that small, tiny, maybe a couple of dB at 250 on that electric guitar, changed the whole. Like it did clear out the full mix. Only one track. So these are the types of instruments where I'm going to look. First, pads. We're talking about pads and keyboards before. They tend also to have a lot of energy in that area. So I'm not afraid to cut out low mids like 250 to 500. Again, always a matter of if I need to or not. What about you?
Right. No, it's the same. So like, if I have this is something that I've talked about extensively. I think I even have a short guide on the if you go to the Audio Issues website and search for muddiness, you'll find like my 6 steps to fixing muddy mixes, which is, so if you're playing all the tracks and it's sounding muddy, if you want to be methodical about it, well, first of all, you want to think about the arrangement, because if everything is playing in the same register, then you're going to have muddiness problems. Not to say that you have to mute something or change a part or whatever. You may want to, if that is in your if that's an option for you. But what you want to do, or what you can do, is you just start building the track again. So I would solo from the kick drum. Let's say it's a hypothetical full band mix, right? Guitars, drums, bass, keyboards, a couple of vocals, whatever, right? So I would try to find the muddiness by methodically going through the track, by building the mix up again, not changing any of the plugins, just starting with like, all right, let's solo the kick drum. Does that sound muddy? Let's add in the rest of the drums. Is that element of the mix muddy? Do I need to change anything in those tracks? If so, go to work on the EQing there, and then add the bass. Does the bass sound muddy, or is it fine? When I add the keyboard and the guitars, usually, and this is often the case, that the combination of all those mid-range instruments will add that muddiness. So that at that point, you may want to sort of reduce some of those frequency areas around 200, 250 in those instruments, or divide them amongst themselves so that they're playing nice together. And then when all else fails, you can add it on the mix bus, but it's technically it's a best practice to do it
to go down.
Yeah.
The mix bus is going to give you where to look. It could give a good indication to where to look for. But most of the time, unless you're doing mastering, this is different, But most of the time, you're going to have those types of problems on individual tracks.
Yeah. Right. All right. David has a question for vocals. What can I do to limit EI tone that is both good and bad about a natural so I'm assuming there's sort of a almost a nasally tone in that sense, or at least that's how I'm gonna approach it. And as you can see in like the EQ screenshot here above, there is a frequency area that I marked as "quote unquote" nasal, which is where a lot of vocals end up sounding kind of like the vocalist has a cold, but also it's also common that's where a lot of the sort of ugly horn sounds are. So for saxophones, flutes, and things like that, often you need to tame that a little bit so that it gets a little smoother. So I would look there. Another culprit is the 300 to 400 area, where things are honky. And so like what that basically sounds like is as if you put your hands over your mouth and you kind of sound like this, right? So this is a predominance of 300 in a sense. And then, if you have an overload of 300 and an overload of 1K in a voice, you may end up with sort of a honky nasally voice, which seems like something that David is asking about. What about you?
I totally agree. And sometimes, depending on the line you're singing, also the key of the song, some frequencies might be more problematic than others. And sometimes dynamic EQ can also work very well on vocals.
Right. Yeah, dynamic EQ for sure.
Yeah,
Totally.
especially on the low mids, where you don't want to cut those frequencies on the entire song. Sometimes it's only one part of the song
Right.
where the singer sings a bit lower. That
Yeah.
might be the problem. So treating that track, like that part of the song, on a separate track could be an idea, or just use dynamic EQ on those problematic frequencies can help.
Right. And often, if you get the typical sort of quintessential like rock song where it's like quiet verse and loud chorus, often it's good to have just a different processing for
Yeah,
the verse
that's what I like
vocal,
to
because
do.
the verses, your 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 voice will sound different, and it will technically have a different frequency response
Hmm?
once you start singing louder. And so oftentimes there's a lot more high mids going into the mic when you're like
Oh yeah.
belting out something, right?
Oh yeah.
And so you may want to duplicate that track or process them differently, and that's where dynamic EQ or multiband compression
Yeah.
comes in handy a lot. Yeah, what else is going on here? I'll answer this question. Is the audio issues EQ CPU heavy? I did just get an email today from a person that was using the EQ on at least 30 tracks in their song in
Cool.
their session. So, and it wasn't it wasn't killing their CPU. So
That's good.
that's what they reported to me. I've been using it well in a bunch of sessions in trainings and stuff like that. So I don't think it is. All right. Three Dog Recording Studio says, I'm loving the trick Chris shared a few weeks ago where you make a mid-range filter low end, cut up to 250, and then cut up highs to 5. Oh, yeah. Can you elaborate on this?
Yeah, that's Andy. Good to see you, bro. He's one of my students, and yeah. So that's a video I have on my YouTube channel talking about how to focus on the mid range while mixing, because let's face it, everything happens in the mid range.
Right.
And a lot of mistakes that young engineers are going to do is to focus on the low end.
Right.
We love the low end, we need the low end, so but reality is the mid-range is where your mix is going to live for the most part. So the idea was just to take an EQ or a multi-band compressor without the compression actives, just to isolate those frequencies between 200 or so, which I consider the kind of a starting point of the low mids, up to 5K. So this is going to mimic, what the Auratone speaker is going to give you in a way,
Right.
So, and then you just compare with professional mixes. You reference your mix with a professional mix, and it's just going to help you to focus more on the mid-range, and if your mix translates well as far as the mid-range goes.
Right. Yeah, and it's funny. There's actually a question here that was submitted ahead of time. Is there anything to be gained by sharply cutting the master below 20 hertz and above 16 kilohertz? So I always cut the master at 30. I think I usually try to do that, but I think 16 kilohertz is too low. I
Might be too low. Yeah.
I don't put any filters on the top. But what like you were saying, like I use a baritone, which is just an Auratone knockoff from Behringer, the cheapest of the budget brands. But and that's basically what you're doing. You're simulating a crappy speaper, right?
And by the way, just to be clear, we're not bouncing our mixes with.
No, right.
It's just for reference. Okay.
Right. Yeah, because you want to make sure that it all translates in that way too.
Exactly. Once you get the mid-range right, the rest is going to be bogus. The low end is going to sit way. It's going to be easier to get a better low end, when your mix range is your mid-range is well balanced.
Right. Mike Moore says, learning EQ is a mystery to me as a beginner. I've had my DAW Logic for about a year. How do you begin to understand the EQ processing world so you can really understand it? Well, the reason I came out with this audio issues EQ is so that I can make it easier for you, so that you know exactly where to search for things that are bothering you in the mix. And it's also why it comes with its own 12-part in-depth e-course and a reference book, so that it doesn't actually have to stay a mystery to you. So if that's something that you're interested in learning more about, check out the link here on the screen.
I'm going to add something. The more, I think you also talk about that perspective also. I see EQ, but like in reality, EQ is what? It's volume knobs, basically.
Right. Oh, yeah.
The whole spectrum, the whole frequency spectrum, if you bring all the frequencies up and down, you're basically just playing with the fader, of the channel. It's the whole volume. So every frequencies, when you boost a frequency or attenuate a frequency, you're just like you're playing with a volume knob on that specific range of frequency. So think of it this way. It's a bunch of volume knobs that you're playing with.
Right. Yeah, it's like a frequency dependent fader.
Yeah, exactly.
You're just picking that. Yeah, that's a really good way of thinking of it. Randall says that the EQ is pretty lean on CPU so far. That's good. Let's see what else is going on here. Lots of questions here and lots of comments. Ollie is here. Hey, Ollie. He's an insider of mine. Let's see here. All right, let's move into some of these questions that I got ahead of time. In top-down mixing, you're familiar with that concept, of course. Is there a right or wrong place to put corrective EQ? Group buses or individual channels, or a mixture of both depending on where you hear the problem? Or do you try to isolate / identify the problem frequencies on the individual tracks?
Honestly, I always tend to go towards the individual track when it comes to corrective EQ. I'm going to start mixing. I do kind of a blend of a lot of things when it comes to mixing. So I don't like to use a term like top down or whatever, I'm going to start with my mix bus because I mix into compression, and I have a tape machine on and a console emulation plugin, and I start with this. Everything else is going to come later if I add anything else for texture mainly. But when it comes to correct frequencies, and we talked about that earlier on this chat, and it's just to focus, like a lot of those problems are going to come from the source itself, and this is what I'm going to focus on mainly. If like for drums, mainly I'm going to focus on the kick, the snare and stuff, unless I'm mixing maybe like a jazz production where the drum kit is like mic with a couple of mics, maybe 2-3 mics, and now I'm going to focus in that case on the full drum sound for the most part. But even then, it depends. But yeah, I'm going to start with individual tracks for correcting stuff.
Well, it's also usually, because if you're EQing a group and only one of the tracks in the groups has a problem, you're essentially taking some frequencies or manipulating all the other tracks that don't really need to be fixed.
Exactly.
So
exactly
that way too.
Once that is done, once I'm done correcting the individual tracks, if the drum bus needs some EQ, I'm going to add EQ. I'm going to enhance some frequencies for the full drum sound because it's not the same perspective as mixing individual tracks. Now I'm looking more as the whole of the drum sound, like the drum sound as a whole. So as one instrument that I'm going to EQ separately. So if I need to, and from this point, I can enhance the clarity of the drum sound by boosting a bit of highs and even by cutting some low mids if I need to, which I don't necessarily need to do it on individual tracks because I'm looking more as the big drum sound, as an instrument on its own, a bit like mastering does it on a full mix.
Right.
So
yeah. Jack Shot Records asks, any tips for EQing for parallel drum compression? Certain ideal ranges for filtering or cutting. Do you filter pre-compression and then boost after? What do you think?
Oh, for parallel drum, I don't EQ a lot of my parallel compression channels. Usually, I do EQ reverbs, like especially signal going into a reverb. I'm going to filter out those reverbs. Sometimes, though, it can be useful if I was to or when I do add like an EQ on parallel compression, I'm going to do it after usually.
Yeah.
If I have to do it, boosting a bit of 100 and boosting a bit of highs, and that can actually add a bit more clarity on top of the compression.
Right.
Which is not a bad thing. This is basically what the New York parallel compression trick is all about. Basically, it's compression, but it's also an EQ on top of that.
Yeah, like it's sort of like the common trick is you. And for those who don't know, parallel compression trick, I put something really fast, like an 1176 is usually like the best bet. Fast attack, slow release, because you're trying to basically just cream the drums. You're trying to make them, you don't want almost any transients or anything like that. It's just cream underneath to add that extra punch or extra power, because it's in parallel, all the transients and all those dynamics are going to be on the original track anyway. And so if you add an EQ and then just really compress it, like minus 10 dB gain reduction, even 20, I don't know, whatever sounds good, obviously. But then in EQ after, I think the sort of common advice is boosting the highs and the lows to sort of create a smiley curve. You can also just cut the mids to create a subjective boost in the highs and lows. And often when you really compress something like that, you're basically pushing all the frequencies or all the dynamics together. So you may want to EQ some more of that boxiness in the mids away anyway, at which point you end up with a slightly smilier curve.
Yeah. Makes sense.
Yeah. All
Love
right.
your picture, Jack, by the way. I can relate.
Yeah. Nice. Let's go here. How do you know when to use mid-side EQing? Do you use mid-side a lot?
Not a lot.
No?
Sometimes on the mix bus, if I need to. Mastering, yes.
Yeah.
Mastering, it does a really nice job. You can use mid-side EQing to add more stereo width to a sound.
Yep.
By like cutting the adding a high pass filter on the sides, for example, so the low frequencies are going to be more focused in the center.
Yep.
And you can brighten up the sides, and do the opposite as you did.
Right.
And that is going to increase a bit of the stereo width in a way,
Right. Yeah.
Stuff like that, but it's not something that I work with a lot on when mixing.
Right.
Keyboards, though, with pads and stuff, that can be very useful, though.
Right. Especially if you're trying to take, if things are getting cluttered up in the center of the mix.
Yeah.
Using an EQ set to mid mode and cutting the high mids in mid mode, just making sure I'm as clear as possible here, means that you're taking those high mids out of the center of the signal. This doesn't make sense. I have to face the camera. And that in that way, you're actually creating room in the middle, in the center of the mix for whatever you want to bring forward, usually the vocal or a lead element. But that, if it's a big stereo organ pad, whatever, it's still going to stay in the sides of the mix, but it won't be in the way of the stuff that you want to focus on in the middle. So I tend to have just an EQ on my mix and or master bus. That's just a stereo filter at 30 and a side filter at 75. So all of the stuff below 75 hertz is filtered out of the sides, which means that there's just an extra tightness in the lows. So it's a good way to clean up your or get basically a punch your low end in that way.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right.
There was a question I saw about. Let me check.
Yeah, I think you can click. You can click on it, right? You can.
Can I?
Yeah.
I don't think so.
Oh.
One from David Bellinger: EQ before compression or vice versa?
Oh yeah. That's
the classic question.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Let's do that. So EQ before or after compression? What is the mystery here, Chris?
Listen, there's no rules. To begin with, it's not like you need. This is how it works, and this is how you need to do it.
Right.
No, you always go with your ears. What I do for the most part, I can start with on a regular basis. What is going to work well for me most of the time is going to be to correct all of my bad frequencies. Bad frequencies. That's a very weird term, but problematic frequencies. Fix those up before I add compression, because I don't want that compressor to react to those frequencies,
Right.
and those frequencies that are a bit too loud to trigger the compressor, So I usually going to start by, if I have like a sound that is a bit too muddy, I'm going to cut a bit of mud before compressing that sound, and then I'm going to enhance. I'm going to like to enhance with another EQ. Usually I'm going to go with something a bit more vintage type of EQ, like Paultec EQ type of EQ, just to that is a bit more musical, I would say.
Yeah.
And works well for boosting stuff.
Paultec. Yeah.
Yeah. So that usually is going to work well. But again, it depends on the sound that I'm mixing. Sometimes it's just going to work well to add a compressor right away. So
yeah. So I mean, I agree with all that. That's basically like, you don't need to compress something you don't want. So taking stuff out first, corrective EQing, and then you can compress if you in that sense. And because what happens when you compress is that a specific signal will always have maybe more frequency energy in a specific frequency area. So if let's say a snare might have like a lot of if you look at it through a frequency analyzer, you'll see that there's a lot more high or high mid thwack, if you will, in a snare, but the lows aren't as predominant, right? You'll see that on a frequency analyzer. But what happens is, like, we'll think of it this way, right? Or I'll do it so that it looks I love doing this. All my insiders know that I just talk with my hands when I'm like when I could easily screen share.
I like that.
But basically what happens is, like, if there's more frequency energy on this side of the spectrum and you add a compressor to it that's squeezing it, the compressor will hear this frequency area first or more, and it's pushed this down without this one necessarily getting affected, right? So what happens is you put the compressor on. Now you have a more level signal that's devoid of all the unnecessary frequencies that you wanted, but you really liked this high mid stuff. So that's why you add another EQ after, and you maybe boost those high mids a little bit more to bring them back. So you've tamed the dynamics, which is necessary, but you've also, by doing that, you've sort of taken the frequency curve away that you wanted originally. Yeah. Hopefully that was useful. All right. How much difference will a treated room make with EQ choice? And if you can't room treat, do you recommend headphones?
Let me read that again. How much?
So basically, like acoustic treatment, I recommend acoustic treatment.
Big time.
Yeah, it's crazy how it's overlooked, especially when you're beginning, because it's the least sexy thing you can buy is just like some padding on the walls.
Yeah, and it's it can be complicated also to do the research, make sure you're doing it right, and so even for someone like me who has a lot of experience in the studio. Acoustic stuff, like acoustic treatment, is always something that is out of my pay grade,
Right.
in a way.
Yeah,
So
like the physics of it. Yeah,
exactly,
forget it.
you
I
know.
don't have that. That's
But
one of
it
my
is
favorite.
important to have at least something, some padding going on, a minimum of treatment
Right.
in a room. Because that room is going to influence your listening position, the way you listen, the way the sound is going to come out of your speakers. There's reflections. There's a lot of stuff going on there, and especially that famous EQ trick: you boost to find a bad frequency and then you cut.
Yeah.
If you're mixing in a bad room, doing so might play some tricks on you.
Yeah.
By
Because
boosting frequencies, if you're boosting like a frequency like 500 hertz and you have a big problem at that range of frequency in your room,
right.
your sound is going to sound way too boxy, and
Yeah.
you're going to tend to cut way more than needed in reality. So
Yeah. And it'll sound
having
terrible when you play it somewhere else.
exactly, and then
Yeah.
you wonder why your mix sounds like poop. When you're back in your car. So,
right.
So it is important.
Crying in your car all the time.
Yeah, and exactly.
Just sobbing silently, listening to the music.
So yeah, a good alternative if your room is not quite right. Doing stuff, mixing tasks on headphones that well.
Yeah,
I don't have a problem with that. I do it myself too.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, checking things on headphones for sure. Having some bare minimum acoustic treatment is totally worth the investment. It's definitely worth a lot more than many other types of gear you can buy, even though it's maybe takes a little more research and stuff like that. But I have a combination of like the Auralex stuff, which is like thin foam. It doesn't treat at lower levels. That's why I have big homemade bass traps behind me. So like the bare bones is basically like I like decouplers for your monitors too, so that you're not turning your desk into an amplifier for like low mids, because that's if you decouple your monitors away from the wood, you'll get a more accurate representation of what's coming out of your speakers. And then behind the speakers is a good place to put your acoustic treatment, and then directly to the right, left, and up if you can. So I have a ceiling cloud, and I have like the early reflection zones. I also use the SonarWorks reference. I turn it off and on just to gauge how it sounds, and then I usually go through all my 3 different speaker sets plus the earbuds and the headphones.
Yeah, same here. SonarWorks is great for fine-tuning your room. After it's not going to replace acoustic treatment, but it's good for fine-tuning.
Right. All right. Let's see here. Dharmika, she's an insider of mine too. Welcome. Thank you for taking the time. She asked, where do you recommend starting EQ hunting for just a folk guitar and vocal mix? Any sort of starting points you'd recommend?
Where do you recommend starting? For a folk guitar and vocal mix, first, the first thing I do is I take a reference and I check, where to start going by the reference I want to compare that recording with. Usually these types of production, full guitar and vocal mix, are going to tend to sound a bit more organic, more darker than a pop production. I think it's like anything else. I'm going to start looking at listening to the mid-range, especially low mids. Usually there's a lot of stuff when it comes to correction EQ that is going to start with the mid-range.
Right.
Usually, especially if this is a production where you record your guitar at the same time as singing, there's going to be a lot of close miking.
Yeah.
So a lot of the closer you mic an instrument, the more bass frequencies and low mid frequencies are also going to be recorded. So this is where I'm going to start hunting first.
Right.
In that situation.
Yeah. Yeah, and sort of I've talked about this before. I think there's a section in the EQ strategies book. but it's sort of the inverse relationship between like the amount of stuff in the mix and the amount of EQing you need to do. Because you don't need to create, you don't need to like create frequency areas and pockets and all these like fancy advanced tricks for something that is as simple as just a guitar and a vocal. You might just be doing some corrective EQing here and there just to make those instruments sound just, you're just enhancing what's already there and maybe taking a few things out that are unflattering. The fun fact, the cheap range here that I put on the EQ is basically for acoustic guitars. Acoustic guitars just always have that sort of like Walmart style sound in around 800, and I always like to dip a little bit out of there. It smooths them out a little bit more. So.
Exactly. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
But you're right about being going easy on EQ when it comes to a small production like this, with just a couple of instruments.
Right.
That you don't need to overthink things.
Right. Right. All right, let's see if there's more questions here. There's lots of questions coming in, but I'll try to make sure that, where was I? Okay. All right. Let's go. Well, let's see here. About harsh vocals, what to adjust when the song volume has crescendo to louder and powerful. I would say like it's either an automation or a compression thing. And if they're harsher at louder volumes, I would do dynamic EQ or multi-band compression on the harsh area, which is in and around 2 to 3K.
Yep.
Yeah. Is it better to EQ vocals before instruments or instruments first? So this is more of a, what's your basic mixing approach? What do you do when you build a mix or approach a mix, Chris?
EQ vocals before. Okay. I'm going to start by doing a rough mix without any plugins to begin with, to have a sense of what the song is all about, and have a feel of the production and the recording. So I'm first going to balance the mix out, and this is going to be my starting point. And then I'm going to focus on, if it's a rock song or a pop or a country song, kick, bass, like drums especially, bring up the bass. But I always going to keep the vocals on, bring the vocals once in a while.
Yeah.
Even if it's not EQ'd, I'm just going to bring it on.
Right.
And so I always have a sense of what that vocal, how well the vocal sits with the rest of the production, the rest of the instruments. But I'm going to, I'm a drummer, so by nature I'm gonna go with drums. And first and secondly, because drums and bass are the foundation of the rhythmic section of a song, so those needs to be. I spend a lot of time on drums and bass to make sure that they work well together, they're tight together, and we have very nice foundation going on. And I'm gonna spend a lot of time on vocals also. So those are kind of my two main instruments. Right. So do I EQ vocals before or after? I'm going to say after for the most part.
Yeah. Yeah. I tend to do that too. There's obviously, well, like I say in this book right there, I talk about like mixing with no plugins, which is what you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
It's the crucial first step. Things have to sound pretty good without any plugins, because you don't want to have to be fixing a bunch of stuff, and you want to make sure that everything's in time and in tune, and all the recordings are good and the tracks sound great, and then you can sort of fix a few things and then flatter and enhance everything else. So yeah, and I tend to build a mix. I tend to get a fader mix, and then I'll build in and around that. Sometimes I'll just start with the drums, and sometimes I'll start with the drums and then I'll put the vocal on before everything else, just for the mix level, because like the vocal wants to be, or you want it to be the loudest thing in the mix, and that it's always that you're always can hear. So having it on as the loudest part of the mix helps you sort of massage the rest of the tracks in place.
Exactly.
All right. And then Bruce says, hopefully I can listen to this again. Please let us know if it will be available. Yes, it will be. What happens is that once we're done, basically this just becomes a YouTube video on a replay video on YouTube and Facebook as well. If you are, well, he's on YouTube, I can see that. But so you can always, go through it. I'm not expecting everyone, all 150 of you to be be here for 3 hours, but I will be here for you. All right,
there you go.
All right, let's see what else. All right, bass element sounds great on monitors and headphones, but disappear on earbuds, cell phones, and cheap computer speakers. What is best practice to the bass sound? How do you make the bass? Basically, this question is, how do you make the bass sound good on small speakers, right? What's your approach to that?
So bass only sounds great on monitors and headphones, but disappear on earbuds. That's because earbuds don't reproduce bass well, right. Basically. Right. So, that's why we're talking earlier about the mid-range.
Right.
How important it is to have your mix sound good in the mid-range. So if your bass sound good, like bass frequencies sound good on your speakers and on other systems that reproduce bass frequencies well, you're good. The most important thing is that your mid-range translate well on all sets of monitors, earbuds, and the car, a cheap computer speaker. So if you have, again, the mid-range right, your mix is going to translate well on most systems.
Right. Yeah, and for bass guitar in general, I love using this trick. It's just a parallel bass EQ. I basically send the bass to another track, and I add an EQ on that track, and I filter out all the lows, everything like below 200, and then I boost in the tone area between 300 and 400 on the bass, and sometimes 700, 600 or 700, which is sort of the second order harmonics of that area, and then you blend that in until you just get like a lot more definition to your bass, and that often helps that bass cut through on smaller speakers, because now you're adding more selective mid-range to,
exactly.
All right, do we mix into a bus compressor or afterwards? You said that you mix into a compressor. How do you
into
what's your mix bus compression method?
It's very straightforward, very simple. I use whatever I'm going to use. Usually I use my Tegler Cram. It's a hardware compressor. And I actually don't touch it. It's set up to the same parameters, and I just mix into it. And I adjust the amount of gain reduction by the amount of signal I send in that compressor. So this is going to be set up in Cubase. So the more level I send, the more, instead of playing with the threshold, I'm just going to answer a bit more input. So I do it very simple, 2-to-1 ratio, slow attack, 30 milliseconds or so, faster release. It's a VC compressor, so it's going to go down to 100 milliseconds of release time. So I keep it kind of a punchiness out of the mix. And I'm not very aggressive when it comes to gain reduction. I keep that at around 2 dBs of gain reduction to 4, depending on the mix. So I just like my mix to swim in that compressor, just to glue things together. But I do mix into it. And I don't add that compressor after I'm done mixing. I just mix right into it.
Right. Yep. Yeah, and I do the same just in the DAW. I have a few different. So I set up my mix template with like a lot of plugins on the buses, but they're all deactivated. Some of them have preset settings that I like, but they're all deactivated. And I might have 3 different compressors on the mix bus, and then I demo like which one which one is reacting the best to the music. And then I'll pick that as my mix bus compressor. Sometimes I might go overboard and add a few more mix bus things, but that's basically it, because you want to, I don't know. It's always been a thing that I do. It just makes the mix sort of, it feels easier to get it together, because it always feels a little more glued than anything else, than if you don't.
Totally agree.
All right, another question here. A few more questions maybe before Ian shows up. So here's a question. How do you feel about EQs and reverbs built into the VST rather than using outside EQs like the Audio Issues EQ?
I do both.
Yeah.
Especially with filters, high pass and low pass filters, I use a lot of the Cubase filters that I have access to per channel. And they are pre-insert. So if I EQ a reverb, usually on the reverb, I'm going to add a low pass and high pass filter most of the time, makes the reverb more transparent. And I just simply use that high pass filter on that channel right away. It's very easy access and and easy to work with. So I do both because I use plugins also, of course.
Right. Yeah. So and I think I probably do it most of the time on reverbs and delays because it's just like, oh, there's a filter there. I'll just tweak this. I don't need to because it's if you're going for something simple, you don't need like a fancy analog style emulation if you're just trying to take some stuff away. Yeah.
And usually stock plugins tend to be like CPU friendly, big time.
Right. All right. Well, we're on the hour, and Ian's here.
Awesome.
I'm gonna add him to the stream. And anything you want to leave the audience with before you jump off?
First of all, thank you for showing up. That's pretty cool. I think we have like a nice amount of people watching the stream live, which is quite cool. And I have a bunch of my MCCers, we call them, for the Mixdown coaching community. So
cool.
Very cool to see my crowd, right here with us, so which was pretty cool. So thank you all for being here, and definitely go and check out Bjorkvin's EQ. I really love the concept behind that EQ. It looks very good, and I'm gonna start working with it for sure.
Awesome. I appreciate that a lot. Thank you so much.
Welcome.
I'm gonna add you into the stream. You can say hi, and then you can drop off whenever you want.
Sure.
Ian Shepard, are you there?
Mr. Shepard.
Good evening, gentlemen. I'm here. I'm just sharing the link so that anybody who's on Facebook right now can join us.
Awesome.
Good to
Give me
see
2
you.
seconds.
Yeah.
Hey,
no
you
worries.
too.
No worries. All right, let me go through see if I can find a quick question here. Yeah.
That's okay. I'm done.
All right, cool. All right, cool. Well, thanks again, Chris. This has been super fun.
It was very fun. So thank you again for the invite. I had a blast. So you guys have fun.
Yeah.
Take care, Ian. So it's a hello and see you maybe Friday on the call. So
yeah. Cheers, Chris.
All right.
Talk to you soon. Bye, gang.
All right. Hey, Ian, how are you?
I'm all right. I'm like death warmed up today instead of just death yesterday. Have you explained to everybody? I only told Björgvin that I was going to be able to be here this evening, or it's evening for me.
Yeah.
Like 12 hours ago, because yesterday, literally, I sounded like, nobody will know what I mean if I say Silas Greenback. He's an evil frog enemy from this amazing from the Danger Mouse cartoon that has nothing to do with Danger Mouse the musician. But anyway, Google him, Silas Greenback. That's how I sounded yesterday, and today I feel vaguely human, so that's good.
Well, I'm glad you made it because I have a bunch of mastering questions here for you.
Okay, cool.
Well, for anyone who doesn't know you, can you tell us a little bit about you and your sort of career so far?
Yeah. So I'm a mastering engineer. I've been a mastering engineer for over 25 years now, which is tough to say. So yeah, I've done a load of stuff, a load of recording, mixing, mainly mastering, but also some Blu-ray, DVD authoring stuff along the way. I have a website called productionadvice.co.uk, where the idea was to help people with music production, and it's ended up being almost completely about mastering. so that was a really poorly chosen name. But I have a podcast which has a better name, which is The Mastering Show, which where we talk about mastering a load. My co-host on there is John Tidy from Reaper Blog.
Yep.
I've developed some plugins with meter plugs. There's one called Dynameter, which lets people visualize the dynamics of their music in real time, figure out when they're pushing the limiting and the compression too hard, and can also, oddly enough, help with EQ, which may be something we could dip into later on. But also Perception AB, which is an instant loudness matched bypass button for your master or your entire mix, if you like it, which is also great for helping you figure out whether what you're hearing is an EQ difference or a loudness difference or both, or what's going on.
Right.
And then we also developed the loudness penalty website, which people may know of, where you can go and just find out what's going to happen in terms of loudness to your music on all the streaming services.
Right.
And there's a plugin of that as well because people wanted it.
Yeah. And I use all these plugins all the time. And if you're on YouTube, watching on YouTube, links to all of those plugins are in the description. So feel free to grab it there. I cannot recommend them enough. They are incredible metering tools.
Well, thank you. That's very kind of you to say.
Thank you. Yeah. All right. Let's do. I have a specific Ian questions from the pre-submitted questions because they're sort of mastering slanted.
Okay, cool.
All right. This question is: I'm playing extreme metal and hardcore and record DIY at home, but when it comes to the mix at the end, when I try and master it loudly, it distorts. So, what's the best way to master it loud?
That's really, I've never heard that question before. That's really tough. I mean, I guess the question is, it depends what you mean by loud. Who is this question from?
I don't know. I don't have their names.
You don't have a name. Okay. Because super loudness is not my thing. In fact, one of the other things that I did that I didn't mention is I founded a thing called Dynamic Range Day, where we talk about loudness and dynamics and the problem of the loudness wars, which might have given somebody I know an idea for a day about EQ. I don't know.
Yeah, I thought if you can make a holiday, I can make a holiday.
There you go. Exactly. Everybody should have a holiday, right? Right. Mine should probably be whiskey, the next one that I do. But yeah, loudness. I mean, okay, so we're talking about EQ. If you want extreme loudness, I don't recommend extreme loudness.
Right.
So there is a lot of stuff in the, especially technical metal genres that are like right up there at kind of -6, -4 LUFS.
Yeah.
I don't think that does the best service to the music. And in particular, we mentioned loudness penalty. It's going to get turned back down again by 8 or 9 dBs online. So it feels kind of pointless to me. But there are people who want to achieve that goal. And if you want to get anywhere close to that, one of the first reasons that you're going to get distortion in a master is the bass. And it's fairly easy to imagine why. If you think about the bass waveforms, if you just played a bass sound on its own, they kind of tend to be smooth and slower. So larger waveforms. Than all the kind of high frequency stuff that is kind of super spiky. And when you push those smooth, wide waveforms up towards 0 dBFS or 0 dB in a DAW, those waveforms get squashed up against that peak level. And because the bass sounds themselves are quite pure, you hear that much more quickly. If you take something like, I don't know, maybe a snare or a distorted electric guitar that's got a ton of distortion in there already, it's a really jagged, jangly waveform, loads of harmonics going on. It's actually harder to hear the distortion in that, or you don't hear it as soon, or you might just think that the new distortion that you're causing is kind of part of the distortion that was there in the sound already. Whereas if you have something like a decently recorded kick drum or a bass guitar, or, the low frequencies of other sounds in the mix, those distort really quickly because the waveform gets squashed, and our ears are really sensitive to that. Also to do with the amount of power that's involved in the sound. There's a lot of energy down in those bass frequencies. So you bring the level up and they crunch first. Right. So one thing that people who want extremely loud masters will do is they will roll out some of the bass. That could be a low shelf, just kind of gently taming those things. Some people will even go in with a low cut to roll those frequencies right off. And it works, right? Because there's less of those frequencies in there. So what distortion, they don't distort as soon, and what distortion you hear is maybe not as noticeable. But the problem is you lose the bass. And that's, one of the reasons for me. I mean, bass, if you want super loud, you're going to have to choose between somewhat distorted bass. And there's lots of flavors of distortion. And I mean, one of the arts of doing great work mastering super loud is to find the flavor of distortion that fits the genre, fits the style, and is hopefully complements the music rather than damaging it. I mean, for me personally, there's still a point you get where you can't go any further. But definitely, well, to broaden this out, to be more general, if you want to get a loud master, you have to have a balanced EQ. If you have a mix where there's way too much bass, or turn it around the other way, if you have a bass where there's loads and loads of upper mid-range and no bass, it's almost impossible to get those to sound super loud. I mean, you just crank the level up, and however loud they get, they just don't feel loud, because there's a huge difference between just measuring loud on a meter, right, and it actually sounding loud. Right. There's all of those ingredients from the production and the mix that go into that. And having a balanced EQ is one of them. I mean, stop me whenever you get bored. But another kind of factor in this is that to get stuff loud, you need compression and limiting. And if you have unbalanced EQ going into compression and limiting, they don't react in a musical way.
Right. So they're just reacting to whatever the highest frequency areas are.
Exactly. So your classic would be, you've got your drums mixed good and loud. So you've got a big kick drum thumping away in the mix, especially in something metal, one of the metal or aggressive genre.
Right.
If you put that and that's got a ton of EQ energy in that area, that's hitting the threshold of the compressor, that's triggering the compression, and the whole mix is going to pump because of that. So one way to help, well, you could EQ after that, right, to balance out the EQ, but then you're left with that pumping that's in the sound anyway.
Right.
So it's much better, in my opinion, to get a balanced EQ going into the compression. You'll get less pumping, so less artifacts from the compression, less noticeable compression. Because for me, in being in mastering, the flavor compression should happen in the mix stage. In mastering, it's all about being invisible, in my opinion.
Right.
So yeah, a balanced EQ at that point will enable you to get better results from everything that comes afterwards. I mean, I think balanced EQ just makes everything better. I don't know what you and Chris have already talked about on this, but that's kind of one of the things that I want to get across to people. Today is EQ day. Yeah. It's, I mean, in mastering, everybody talks about, the plug-in chains and the analog gear and the dither and which limiter you use and stereo widening and all this stuff. 80% of the work is getting the EQ right. Right. So, job one, get the level right, figure out how loud it's going to be. Yeah. And then you start tweaking the EQ, and the EQ changes the way that you feel about how loud it sounds. So then you tweak the loudness again, and then you listen to the EQ again, and you just optimize those two, balance them, and hone in on the perfect result. Right. You can get amazing results in mastering just using EQ and some gentle limiting. So yeah, anyway, I'll stop.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's you're talking about the mixing phase, like, for the color and stuff like that. There's actually a video on my YouTube channel that's just like I think I called it like the secret weapon to getting loud mixes. And it's like a variation of like the back bus technique, which is basically just a bunch of parallel compression in your mix in order to get sort of the loudness from the center of the waveform out, rather than like squeezing the waveform with a limiter or a compressor, right? You're adding more amplitude from the bottom of the waveform, or the center, if you think of it that way.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Yeah. Other question here. So now we do a lot of the common best practice now, or the common wisdom, which I don't know if is correct because people still listen to albums, but independent musicians are told to release tracks, release singles regularly in order to have something to promote, whatnot. So what, in can we walk through the difference between mastering a single track and then mastering an album?
There's not a huge difference for me, except that figuring out what you need to do with a single track is harder. If you've got an album, that's probably at least 10 songs that you can listen to, and there's going to be some that are louder, some that are quieter, some that may be more aggressive, some that may be more chilled out, some might be happy, some might be sad. So there's probably a bit of a journey in there, or at least some variety. So you listen to those and you kind of go, okay, so that's the high point, that's the most intense moment on the album, and that gives me I'm going to make that this loud, and then everything else will be balanced from there. So I will quite often the loudest song will be the first song on the album, or the biggest. Quite often people put the single at the start of an album,
sure,
the first single. But if they're kind of starting off more gently or whatever, then I might pick one of the later songs. I might start with that biggest moment and work back from there. So that kind of gives you your reference point, if you like, where, and all your other decisions are, well, how do these things fit in musically with that key moment? If you've only got one song, you don't have that. So then for me these days, to be honest, I just do what I think, unless the client has specifically said, oh, we want it to sit well in a playlist next to this.
Oh yeah.
And actually then I still do what I think. But then I'll listen to the referencing they've, I'll go with my instincts, and then I'll listen to the reference and use loudness penalty or loudness match them myself to make sure that I know that I'm hearing them as most people will hear them, which is on Spotify or YouTube or wherever.
Right.
And then I kind of think to myself, well, do they work? And if not, then I'll tweak what I've done to fix whatever the difference might be. But most of the time that works really well. So if the client's given a reference, then that's really easy. If they haven't, if it's, most of my clients are repeat customers. So there's other stuff that we've already worked on. So I kind of tend to pretend that this stuff is going on an album, even if that's not how they mean it to. Mm-hmm. So I would just kind of think about it in comparison to the rest of their work, or maybe a previous album or whatever. But failing all of that, then you can just look for other reference material. When it's single songs, you need to think, where is this likely to show up? Right. For me, part of the thing about mastering is it's kind of weird, because you come in at the end of the process and you take what somebody's done and say, oh, you need to do this will make it much better, but when you do that, you don't want to change it. Before you get to that stage, you need to listen to it and think, okay, that I hear what they were trying to do, they're going for this, or you need to have empathy for what they're trying to achieve, what they want the song to do, and you're just trying to move it in that direction. Right. Part of that is just figuring that out for a song or an album. Bringing it back to EQ in terms of an album versus a song, one thing that I would say that's really important is we're not trying to match EQ. Right. There are these plugins out there will automatically match things and all the rest of it. It's more about balance. In a song, you might have something that's really full throttle and all the frequency bands are going full tilt, and then something that's much more stripped back and intimate, or deliberately sounds muffled or tinny or whatever. So again, it's kind of understanding what that is, the intention is musically, and then doing something that's appropriate. So it's about finding the right EQ balance between the songs, as opposed to trying to match them. And actually, there's such a huge variety of stuff out there anyway, that there is no wrong or right. It all comes down to some extent taste. Although I always like to say, if you think about everything you could record on a digital format, from complete silence to complete noise, most music that's out there fits into this middle bit. There's maybe a bird song or steel pan music or something is kind of at the edges of that, but there's this, and then what I do is kind of right in the middle of that. Not to say that it's average, but it's not at the extremes. You're trying to get it because one of the goals is to make things translate, right. Which is another important thing about getting the EQ right at the mastering stage. If you think about, it's got to sound good on a pair of these, and it's got to sound good on a club PA or Apple Beats that are really bassy. Yeah. Your goal then, in terms of the overall EQ balance, is to have something that doesn't have too many extremes. If you make something that's super bassy so that it sounds good on these, when you listen to it on the club PA or on the beats, it's going to sound ridiculous.
Right.
Whereas if you master it so that it kind of sounds balanced on a pair of beats, then it'll sound super tinny on these. So what you're going for is something that sounds neutral in the mastering room. And then when it gets played back on beats, it'll sound bassy. When it gets played back on these, it'll sound a bit tinny, but that's what everybody expects.
Yeah.
So the secret of translation in EQ for mastering is not, you can't make it sound amazing on everything, but you can make it sound right on everything, you know, so that it fits in with everything else everybody hears.
Right. Because like people are also used to how they not only us audio engineers, we like know our monitors or whatever, but like people know what their Apple earbuds sound like, you know, and they're expecting music to sound a specific way.
That's right. Exactly. Yeah. If you're driving in a car and you've got, you know, huge 18-inch woofers in the boot,
yeah,
you know, when anything comes on, even if it's, I don't know, Taylor Swift or something, you expect the car to shake.
Yeah.
Right. But we don't have to deliver that. The car does that bit of it.
Right.
We deliver something balanced, and then, yeah, it sounds as people expect it to.
Right. And it's, you mentioned something earlier that was an interesting thing, because it, you know, you're mastering it for the location which it will be found and listened to, right? So you're trying to reference it maybe next to something else. But what artists may want to consider is, especially if they're mastering their own stuff or trying, you know, doing things of that nature, is your songs, even if you're putting out singles, like eventually your top 3-4 songs on Spotify are going to be next to each other. And you want them to sound relatively similar. If somebody just like hears about your band and decides to listen to all your Spotify, they're just going to click on the most played song, and then if they forget, it'll just loop through the songs that are on your profile. So you want it to sound relatively similar in that sense. Yeah, consistent. Yeah, that's a great word to use. Yeah. Because even if it's not an album, it's going to be a collection of songs. Right?
Yeah, that's right. Or you're likely to get put, you know, if you're writing folk rock, you're unlikely to get put next to Mongolian nose flute music, you know, in a playlist, but you're much more likely to put next to other folk rock. So again, kind of having an idea of where that genre is and how you can fit into that best, you know, is a great technique.
Right. Yeah, and there's a good question here from David that sort of piggybacks on just like the difference between mixing and mastering, which I have here in front of me too. So David asked, does the master have to sound more tame than the mix? And so what's your thought about that? You're saying like you're trying to be transparent, but like us mixing engineers or mixing engineers in general, they're maybe trying to get it to be, you know, maybe a little lopsided and maybe a little aggressive and you know, aggressive is a good word to use. So
I think it depends exactly what you mean by tame.
Right.
I mean, for example, one thing, going back to loudness, one thing that I'm always saying, no, your music's going to sound better if it's got balanced dynamics, not super dynamics, but not kind of squashed into a tiny little space.
Right.
But I have heard people say that actually you need that squash to kind of smooth things out, to give people a consistent, pleasant listening experience. And to a degree, I think that's true. I think I achieve that without going to extreme loudness. But there's definitely, I would say, well, we mentioned Dynamic Range Day. Dynamic Range Day was sponsored in the early days by SSL. And Anthony David, who was managing director of SSL then, gave me a great quote, which was that compression isn't about removing dynamics. It's about managing them, right? Managing, like, meaning controlling. So there is an extent to which a mastering engineer will control the dynamics and also, I say correct the EQ, you know, because if somebody was mixing on these, the chances are they've put too much bass in, and it will sound wrong on anything out there that has decent bass reproduction. So as a mastering engineer, you need to hear that and correct for it. But at the same time, you have that empathy for what they were trying to achieve. So I'm trying to move things in the right direction without changing it. I want to try and preserve everything that I hear in the mix. and it's a balancing act. You're managing it and you're controlling it, and I guess in that sense it could be a little bit tame in the sense that it's less wild, right? But that means that it will translate. If you have something that's really wild in terms of really aggressive low end or high end or whatever it is, and dynamics, that will only work on a really small range of systems. And I think if a mastering engineer talks to their client, on the one hand, yes, they have this vision that this is going to be the brightest thing that anybody's ever heard, right?
Yeah.
But it's like, okay, but do you know that will end up translating as tinny and harsh and brittle,
right.
on most people's playback systems? Is that what you want? And then they're like, well, no. So then it's a case of just balancing the EQ so that it still sounds bright and aggressive in the way that they're looking for, but it also works on a really wide range of systems. And in terms of the dynamics, one of the big differences about being in the studio and mixing is that usually we have the monitor gain cranked. And that means that if you have a really soft, quiet passage, you can hear it perfectly. And then when the chorus really hits, it just pins everybody against the wall. And that's fantastic when you're recording and you're mixing. But then you take that and you put it on a phone speaker, or you play it back in a car, and actually what ends up happening is that either people crank it right up so they can hear the really soft, quiet bits, and then the whole thing distorts horribly when it gets to that massive chorus, or they turn it down for the chorus to stop the distortion, and then they can't hear the verse in between, right? So again, it's I don't see it as, taming is, I think if I've tamed the music, then I've gone too far, right? I want to keep, if there's a wild feeling about the music, I want to keep that, but in a way that is going to translate to the widest range of systems. Right. And the same thing applies in terms of EQ. If something comes in, let's say, dub reggae, it's meant to have massive low end, right? There's no way I'm going to take all of that out because I think it's somehow wrong, but I'm going to make sure that it's not going to pop anybody's speaker cones.
Right. Yeah, there's a funny meme out there about like what people think mastering is, and it's like this guy waxing like a Toyota Camry, keeps waxing it, and then all of a sudden it turns into a Lamborghini. It's like, no, most of the work is like happens in the mix stage, and then if your master is somehow drastically different than the mix, there's maybe something off there somewhere, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the funny thing is, quite often you could spend, like, typically I'll spend somewhere between a quarter of an hour and half an hour on the first song on an album. That takes the longest.
Yeah,
maybe even longer, and then it gets quicker after that, because it's all about figuring out what the sound of the album is, where that kind of center line is going to be, and how everything is going to move around that. But you spend all of that time on it, you think, yeah, it sounds great. And then, I mean, I use Perception, my plugin, for loudness matching, but anybody can, back in the day, you'd use faders on a desk, or you could level match it yourself, because you need to compare similar loudness. Otherwise, you'll always think the louder one is going to be better.
Right.
So you match up the loudness and do the comparison, and suddenly you go, well, they don't sound that different. I just spent half an hour and I didn't achieve anything. That's not correct, right? Because if you switched it around and just literally pushed the original mix straight up into a limiter to get the same loudness, and then turned that down, in comparison, it will sound terrible, because the EQ will be unbalanced. Right. It'll be heavily over limited. It's probably distorting in some places. All of that work created something that translates and that works, but doesn't sound that different than, hopefully, the original mix. I mean, sometimes you do. So, sometimes there's like, the classic thing is if somebody's working on NS10s, the sort of standard, they have no bass. It's very common for people to end up with more bass than you're going to want anywhere else in the world in a mix, that was so that it sounded good on NS10s. And then you can make quite a big change. But that's the thing. You see, it's a change that makes it sound the way they wanted it to everywhere else. Right. You change what you have in front of you because it came from somewhere that was slightly too bright or too dull or whatever, but it ends up being exactly where they had it, but that's going to work on the widest possible range of speakers. So yeah, it's funny because mastering is really simple, but it's also really complicated.
Right. Speaking, going back to EQ, is in mastering. What do you have? Sort of a overall workflow / approach to EQing when you're starting to master either an album or a single song?
Yeah, I mean, it's my process is you bring the song into the DAW, And the first thing I do is bring the level up. So I always have a really clean digital limiter at the end of the chain to prevent clipping. I don't master super loud, so usually when I bring things up, they're barely tickling the limiter, or just a little bit, so you're not really hearing that. And once it's up at that the right kind of ballpark level for where I'm going to want it to be eventually, then I listen to the EQ. So, if anybody's thinking, why is he talking about level when Bjorn asked about EQ? It's because our perception of EQ changes with the loudness, right? As you turn things up, you hear more bass and more treble. It's called the Fletcher-Munson curve, or the equal loudness curve, or the smile curve, because as you push the level up, the top and bottom ends of the EQ graph go up. And if you turn it around the other way, if you think about it, say I bring it in and I don't get the level right first, and I put all this EQ in and it sounds great to me, and then I turn it up. But because I turn it up, I'm then hearing more bass and treble than I was before, and suddenly it sounds too bassy and treble in comparison to the way it did when it was lower. So stage one, bring the level up, get it right. And then really for me, it's kind of like layers of an onion. So it's, everybody knows this analogy. You have an onion, it's got this scraggy, dry outer, so you peel that off, and then the next one is fine, but it's probably got a bit of a split in it, so you peel that one off, and then the next one is fine, but there's it's been dinged somewhere. So and after enough layers of the onion, you've got something that's near enough perfect. Same thing with a master in terms of the EQ. So usually when you bring it up, either you hear, okay, that's about right, so I'm going to get straight into the details, or oh, it's a bit too bright, or it's a bit too dull. So I would probably then go in with a high or a low shelf, just to, if I can find that perfect crossover point and slope for that shelf, just to bring the bass up, or take the very high frequencies back a little bit. When you've done that, usually then, like the classic example would be, oh, it comes in, it sounds a little bit thin and hard, so I'm going to warm up the low end. So I go in with a low shelf and I bring it up, and then suddenly I'm hearing some super subby stuff in the kick drum, or somebody's foot was tapping on the floor or something, and there are these booms that people haven't heard, or maybe there's a bit of build up in the bass guitar or the low end of the guitars. So then maybe I need either a low cut to get rid of that subsonic stuff, or maybe I just need a parametric, a little notch to even out that kind of lumpy bit in the bass. You weren't noticing it when all of the bass was lower, but you bring all the bass up using the shelf in a kind of level way, and suddenly the bit that's sticking out bothers you more. So you might end up with it goes up for the shelf, and then there's a little dip because I use that all the time. Or another one is maybe because the shelf extends up into the high frequencies a little bit, like say you've got a crossover at 200 Hertz, that shelf probably gets right up to about 500, probably, if it's a fairly gentle slope. And maybe you don't want to bring up the 500. So then I might go in with a parametric to actually scoop a little bit of that back out, just to clear it out. And then it's just, going on from there. It's like, okay, how's the top end? I'm listening. It's just what bothers me, or what catches my attention next about this. And hopefully each move is smaller, right? So maybe, okay, we added a couple of dBs of low shelf from 200 Hertz down. Okay, and then we had a cut of maybe a dB at 100 Hertz, just because the bass guitar was getting a bit boomy. And then, having brought the bass up, actually, I feel like I need a little bit more energy in the upper mids. So I'm going to boost kind of the 2K region with a nice broad boost. And that maybe, brought out something a bit nasal in the vocals. So I'll have a much narrower notch, but each change you make is kind of getting slower and more detailed. So probably the biggest, most important changes happen within the first 5 minutes. And then everything after that is just kind of the icing on the cake.
Do you tend to be sort of go for like wide boosts and cuts, or do you get surgical? Like what's the bandwidth of the, I know the answer is depends, but like in general, do you tend to be sort of gentle in that sense?
I prefer to make broad changes.
Okay.
Because if you think about it, if it's a good mix in good shape, then the chances are we're basically correcting for quirks and eccentricities, let's say it, in the monitoring and in the room. Lots of people, especially these days, if it's coming from an indie client, chances are they recorded it in a small studio at home. It could be a square room, probably got some inconsistencies in the bass end. even the best studios in the world have inconsistencies in the bass end. So there's no way in hell you're going to get rid of all of them in a home studio. You know, hopefully people have got some acoustic treatment and you know, to improve that stuff. But even so, but those, the kinds of, unless somebody has gone in the mix and really aggressively boosted or cut certain frequencies, if you've got a bass guitar that was basically a fairly balanced sound, and then they're listening to it in a room that's a bit boomy at a certain frequency, chances are they just scooped a bit out at that frequency. So we're correcting for that, you know, just bringing it back in, or just adjusting for, or you know, overall there was not quite enough bass that they were hearing in the room, so the whole mix is a bit bassy, that kind of a thing. So those tend to, you can deal with those really effectively with nice, broad, gentle changes. But every so often you'll get something that, you know, well, another thing that happens quite often is that you'll have one string on a bass guitar that speaks more than the others.
Right. Right.
I'm on a real bass thing this evening, aren't I? So,
well, I mean, like that people want to know how to control the low end, so it's not like.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, and honestly, the low end is one of the toughest things to get right, you know,
right.
Because that's where the room has the most influence on the sound often.
Right.
But yeah, a classic thing would be a particular string on the, so every time this particular string, there's a note on this string, it kind of leaps out at you a little bit. And that would be a good opportunity to go in with a gentle parametric to cut. And also, I mean, the other thing is I keep saying gentle. There was one time when I added 34 dB of EQ at 40 Hertz. And that was to a reggae tune that was coming from a tape dub of a vinyl single.
Okay.
And it sounded great. And it just needed, there was so little bass, you know, either on the vinyl cut or when it was recorded onto the tape, at some point, all of that bass had gone and it needed that low note. So I just kept piling it on and piling on. And amazingly, there wasn't, you know, it had been on I had a stereo capture of the vinyl, so I could, and it was originally mono. So I monoed it. So all of the out of phase kind of weirdness from the vinyl just disappeared. And I was able to boost it. So if you need to do something extreme, I'm not suggesting everybody should go and add, if you need to add 34 dB of gain to a particular EQ band, there's probably a big problem with the mix. But if it's something needs 6 dB somewhere, I'm going to do it. You know, it's not, yes, mastering, the amazing thing about mastering is you can make tiny little moves and it has a huge effect.
Right. And you're boosting everything.
Yeah.
You know, or cutting everything or doing.
Exactly. Your influence. Yes. Yeah, you in mixing, you might go in with 2, 3, 4 dB on a vocal or a keyboard or whatever and barely hear it.
Right.
Whereas when you do that on an entire song, it has a much more dramatic, and also you're limited in what you can do because, okay, so the vocal needs a couple of dB somewhere, but when you do that, the drums get too bright or whatever it is. Right. But if you need that boost and it helps the music, then that's what you've got to do to get the results. So I prefer to be broad, gentle changes, but if you need to get more aggressive and more surgical, then you do that as well. There was one time somebody had a vocal recording. It was so weird, and I actually emailed them and said, "Were the dimensions of this, were they?" And I was able to tell them what the shape of the room was because they had literally a cube. It was, I can't remember what it was, 3 meters by 3 meters by 3 meters or something. And so you could hear the harmonics leaping out in this voice as they ringing,
bouncing around the room,
bouncing around the room and building up at the mic. So I went in with a phase linear EQ and really narrow notches and just took them all out again. And I thought I was trying it, thinking this isn't going to work, and it worked. So you know, it's
right.
You got to do what you got to do.
Yeah. So that segues into this question. So do you know, are there any common EQ problems you find when people submit stuff for mastering?
Yes, all of them.
Okay.
I mean, generally, yeah. I mean, because I think, well, no, it tends to be, in terms of problems, it's most likely due to the bass. Because, you know, it's so hard. If you're in a room where you're not hearing, say, 70 Hertz, you know, it's such a crucial frequency it's involved in the kick drum, it's the low end of the bass guitar, all the rest of it. And in a room, you're also, you know, if you've got a problem at 70, you're probably also going to have a problem at 140 and loads of related frequencies as well. So and the low frequencies are more likely to be affected than the high frequencies with that. So, and I think that's why I end up talking a lot about bass, because that's the bit that's hardest to get right for everybody, even for a mastering engineer, you know, in the best room in the world. And it just gets that much harder if you're in a home studio. So either mixes with holes in the bass response because people are hearing too much in their room and have tried scooping it out to make it sound right, or mixes that don't have enough bass because they're hearing so much in the room that they, you know, no, I just said the same thing twice. Or mixes that have too much bass because they're not hearing enough in the room because they piled it in to try and fill it out. Right. No, it's still the same thing. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Whatever's happening, whatever happens in the room, you get the opposite in the mix.
Right.
And so that's one of the most common things you do to fix it. I'd say another thing is harshness in the high frequencies. You know, I mean, it's good advice to sculpt the EQ, you know, to when you're working on a mix or an arrangement, to think about which frequency band each instrument is active in and make sure that it occupies its own place. Because if you have too many things in the same kind of frequency range, they're going to fight against each other. So, and one of the strategies that people can sometimes suggest is that you might choose to, say, for example, you might cut the low frequencies on a kind of heavy chugging guitar so that it doesn't interact too much with the bass that is kind of working against it. Right. And you might cut out some of the high frequencies in the bass. That can be good, but sometimes people kind of get carried away with that too much, and you end up with a kind of a super thin kind of jangly guitar that's only there in the upper mid range, and a bass that's all sub, or you know, a vocal that is kind of all mid range and or whatever. So those kind of things can be challenging to deal with. And I think, you know, I often hear the kind of advice, oh, use a low cut filter on everything, you know, because people have problems with the bass. One way to avoid problems with the bass is to get rid of it, which is kind of similar to what we were saying at the beginning. Then you don't have any problems, but you have half the mix with no bass information in it. Right. And that's a really good way to get a harsh sounding mix, right? Because it's I mean, every EQ band has its positives and its negatives, you know? Right. So 100 Hertz is all about warmth and richness, but you have too much of it and then it's going to sound flabby and boomy and out of control, you know? And 2K is all about clarity and presence and aggression in vocals and guitars, but you have too much of it and it sounds harsh and kind of tinny. So I've forgotten how I got to what I was saying there.
But like that's exactly the point of like the EQ plugin is having these positive, negative and positive ways of EQing, because, you know, I designed it in such a way that, you know, on the top you kind of maybe subtract mostly if frequencies away, because you're trying to get rid of things you don't want. Originally it was supposed to be subtractive only, but people don't really EQ like that. They want to boost defined and then go down. So that's why it's a full spectrum visual EQ. But then the bottom module is actually boost only, and it's only and it's sensitive, so you never really need to add a ton. But it is the positive attribute of the same frequencies in a sense. There's some difference, and there's more variety, more flexibility on the top one. Everything else is fixed frequencies, but it is basically that, you know.
I had to clear my throat. Yeah, absolutely. And again, it comes back to balance. You know, all of this stuff is about balance. You have it's about just enough, but not too much. You know, if you have just enough 100 Hertz, things are going to sound full and warm and rich. And if you have a little bit too much, it'll sound woolly and boomy and out of control. And, you know, the same thing applies. That's how I got to where I was saying. I was talking about mixes where all of the low frequencies have been cut out and it just ends up sounding harsh because you don't have any of those lower frequencies, you know, everything up to, I mean, 500. I noticed when I was looking at your EQ that you've got the label at the top. I think it's like boxy and I forget what the other one you used was. Yeah. And that's absolutely right if you have too much of those. But also those frequencies are needed for tone and for richness. I mean, if you've got a kind of an electric guitar, then the muscle of the sound is in the 500 hertz region. That's where you want to if you've got a kind of, one of the more advanced things that I might do in mastering is if somebody has got hard right and left panned guitars, kind of chugging guitar riffs in sort of fairly heavy genre, but there's not enough low mid in those, they can just sound a bit harsh and not weighty enough. They don't have enough muscle. They don't have kind of. So what you can do is you can then use a mid side process to only boost that EQ at the edges of the sound signal, and because they're panned hard left and right, you can bring out that that really important area in the frequency curve without muddying up the vocals and everything that's in the middle. So yeah, it's all about balance, and sometimes it's about unbalance as well. Like it's not like everything has to be perfectly balanced all the time, but if you have something that's unbalanced, it kind of makes you, when you're listening to it, you want it to get balanced. So that has an emotional mood, like if you have, I don't know, just strumming acoustic guitar in the intro to a song, it makes it all the more satisfying when the bass and the drums kick in and suddenly the whole frequency spectrum fills out, So that's another thing you have to be sensitive of when you're EQing in mastering, is figuring out, well, what are we trying to achieve musically, and where are we going, and what's that going to do? Yeah. But I think it's one of the really cool things about the EQ that you've come up with, is just it's such a simple idea to put those words that everybody uses in the display, so that people, because I mean, these days, I can listen to something and go, oh, okay, 100 hertz or 2K or whatever. And even more obscure stuff, like, there have been times when I've gone, 72 hertz. But that's not something that I just knew that came to me, that came from doing the job for 25 years. And back when I started out, I mean, words are difficult because one person's warm is another person's bright, and all the rest of it. Yeah. But lots of these words most people agree about things that sound boxy and things that sound nasal and things that sound harsh and all that kind of stuff. Right. And so and there are EQ charts out there, right? You can look them up. You can go and say, this. Yeah. I've made some of them. Right. And I've shared them and they're useful when you're starting out. But what's even more useful is having an EQ where it says boxy. Yeah. And you can grab the thing and push it up and pull it back and say, well, does it make it sound boxy? Yeah, it does. Okay, so I'll reduce it. Oh no, now it sounds thin, so I'll bring it back in. That's a super helpful idea. So kudos. Well done. Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you so much. That's great to hear. Yeah. I had a question, but I forgot what it was because we just get into it. And that's perfectly fine. But Paul here, maybe we can elaborate a little bit about, talking about high pass filtering. Everybody, there's lots of high pass filtering, and you should high pass filter everything and all that, which to a certain extent is true for the mixing phase. And certainly for a lot of instruments, there is nothing there, so you can just take it out. There might be rumble there from the recording, which is always a good thing to take out, feet tapping and stuff like that. And the presets that I included with the plugin all have I don't make arbitrary presets that are, here's like this is the one way to EQ this guitar or whatever. I just try to do like here, similar to why the words are where they are. Here is the common starting point for a guitar, and then smooth out appropriately. And I added the high pass filters to many, but they're all at different ranges. Exactly. It's all a question. It's not like I'm saying you shouldn't ever low cut something that's in a mix. And actually, that is particularly acoustic guitar is a classic one, because you put a nice full frequency mic in front of an acoustic guitar. They're playing something that's up, let's say, kind of 200 hertz and above, but they're thumping the heel of their hand on the guitar body. And every time they do that, there's this big sound, which is down at kind of 60 or 100 hertz maybe. Right. maybe you want some of that in there because of the rhythmic element for the music, but you probably don't want it anywhere near as loud as it might be sounding, because very often the mic placement, and that, incidentally, quick tangent, EQs are fantastic, but the best way to get a great EQ on the sound is to move the mic until it sounds really good for everybody watching this. You know,
recording.
Yeah, exactly. Get it right at the source, as our good friend Joe Gilder says. But let's say you've got a recording where the guitar tone sounded fantastic, but even so, that booming from the guitarist thumping the body of the guitar is just kind of overly present. Then a low cut is going to be a great way to just, you know, and you bring it up so that the shelf just kind of starts to cut into the boom. I mean, maybe you have it as it chops it out completely, if that feels right for the music, but maybe you want a bit of it in there, so you just tame it a little bit. I guess what I would say is that, you know, the risk with low cuts is that, well, if actually that guitar line goes right down to the bottom string of the guitar and is a big warm thing, and there's lots of stuff happening at 200, at 100, and you've got that low cut at 100 because that's what got rid of the thumps, then it's going to interrupt the music as well. And I think that's the kind of point where, or it's going to compromise the result that you can get.
Right.
So I think you're absolutely right. The presets are, everybody uses presets. They're really handy as a starting point. If I'm pulling in a reverb, I just dial through the presets till I find one that sounds kind of like what I want, and then I tweak. The mistake is to expect that the preset will somehow magically, you know, there are mastering processes out there that have presets, and that kind of makes no sense because the preset has no idea what's coming into it. But you can still kind of learn from the settings that the person who set up the preset has chosen. Okay, so they did that. That could be helpful for me. And exactly as you said, the key is to adapt the settings to fit the music that you have. And the same is true of low cuts. You know, if you go in with a low cut at 200 Hertz on everything, you're going to have nothing below 200 Hertz in your mix. And that's not going to work for anything that needs it. So that's the, I think, you know, it's a common piece of advice. It's a good piece of advice until people take it to extremes. You know, so, and I think what you're doing there, if you're saying that you're varying the frequency depending on the type of instrument you're expecting to come in, that's exactly the right, you know, so anybody flicking through those presets are going to go, okay, well, so there's a low cut there and that's for acoustic guitar, but there's another one there and that's different for this instrument. So why is that? You know, start thinking about it, listening to the different sounds of them and figure out what's appropriate.
Yeah, totally. Yep, exactly. All right, let's see. Feel free. We're almost to the third hour. And thank you all for staying with us. Let me know, like, is anybody still here and they've been here the entire time? Say yes in the chat if you would. I'd love to know how many people think that it's a good idea to listen to me for 2 hours. But yeah, let me know. And if you have more questions, do put them in the chat here. Lidge is going to be up in a little bit, but
and if you're enjoying it, share it so that other people can see the stream as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Hit that share button, and also check out Ian's plugins down below. Also check out the Audio Issues EQ at the link there if you haven't already. And yeah, so there's plenty of people that have been here since the beginning, which is great. But one question here about knowing when your mix is ready for mastering. So anything that you usually recommend a mixing engineer or a musician mixing their own music, you know, before they hand their mix over to a mastering engineer?
I think it needs to be as good as you can get it. You know, I think that the mistake is to expect that XYZ will be fixed in the mastering. You know, it is possible to fix all kinds of things, or certainly improve all kinds of things in the mastering, but it's not ideal. You know, I mean, in an ideal case, we do hardly anything at mastering. I mean, there are very few albums where you do literally nothing. You almost always can benefit from, oh, this song will be a little bit louder in comparison to that one. And okay, that one, now that we've changed that level slightly, this one needs a little bit more low frequency or high frequency or whatever it is. Those really subtle changes. But, you know, you don't want to be kind of going in thinking, oh, I never could get the kick drum to hit right, but maybe they'll fix it in the mastering. You know, I mean, maybe they will,
yeah, but doubtful.
Maybe not, you know, and if not, then at that point you're screwed. So yeah, I think it just needs to be as good as it can be. Don't get overly concerned about the overall loudness. You know, I mean, if you or your clients want stuff to be super loud and you're experimenting with adding extra limiting and saturation and all that kind of stuff to achieve it, that's all cool. I would recommend in that case you send that version to the mastering engineer so they can hear what you've been doing, and then also a version with all of that stuff off. I'm not talking about mix bus compression and things that you're using creatively in the mix, but if you've just got something, a maximizer or whatever it is, something in there for pure loudness, take that out, because chances are the mastering engineer will be able to achieve a similar result, but they'll have much more flexibility and room to be creative with what they're doing if that processing hasn't already been applied. So, you know, you need to be careful about that kind of stuff. Yeah, and it, like I say, it just needs to be as good as it can be. Everybody, you know, I mean, what's the old saying? You know, the mixes don't get finished; they just get abandoned. You know, they get to a point where you're like, the deadline is arriving, or you just fall asleep at the console, or can't bear to listen to the thing another time. So at that point, it's probably done and ready for mastering. I mean, I think the other thing is try and leave yourself some time, because if it's not ready for mastering, any mastering engineer worth their salt is going to be, you know, honest and open, hopefully in a kind way, and let you know about that. You know, I will always assume that the mix is perfect in the eyes of the ears of the person who sent it to me, and kind of master it with that in mind. But if I encounter something at the mastering stage where I think, oh, if only, you know, X, Y, Z, like one of the challenges that's really hard to deal with at mastering stage is if the EQ on one instrument is super bright and the EQ on something else is super dark. So a classic would be drums and vocals. You know, if you've got a dull vocal but super bright drums, when you get to the mastering stage, you listen. The vocal is key, right? It's the most important thing in the mix. So you think, oh, I want to brighten that up, and you do, and suddenly the drums are just taking you know, the lining off the inside of your ears, and there's nothing you can do about that. You know, maybe it was a creative decision, and I always assume that it is, and kind of find what I think is the best compromise between the two. But at that point, I would usually say, I couldn't help being curious about whether this would sound even better if we could brighten up the vocal in comparison to the drums. You know, if that's an experiment you're interested in trying, it would be great if you could send that over to me, or maybe send stems or whatever. If you want to do that, you need time. So leave yourself some time after don't kind of mix right up to the mastering day and then send it all off and hope for the best. Try and leave yourself a week or two in advance of the mastering so you can get it over to the mastering engineer. They can listen, give you some feedback if there's any feedback needed. There's time for mix tweaks and revisions if necessary, and that's going to give you the best chance of getting a good result. And, you know, as always, communication is key. So, you know, give the engineer lots of information about what you are hoping to achieve and any concerns you've got about the mix, and choose a mastering engineer who talks back.
Yeah, because it's such a relationship, right? You're giving, like, let's assume that you're working on your own music, you're giving them, like, they're working on your music, and you're proud of this, your baby, you're like, you putting out there, it has to be as good as possible for you. Like, it's, you know, it's everything like hinges on it, right? In our sort of neurotic musical sense. But
the world will end if it doesn't, if it sounds bad.
I know. And this is the song that's going to make my career, right? That's all these sorts of things going through your head. But at the end of the day, it is a relationship. You're bringing somebody in to help you with something that you think is true, like a true work of art, like your creativity in a track, and you want to have a relationship with an engineer that understands that, right? Yeah. And can go back and forth and cares enough to like shoot you an email and say, like, hey, can you do you think you might want to change a few things here? It'll sound better, you know, because they have your interest at heart, right?
Yeah, or who's prepared to do the experiment. I literally had this on the album I just finished working on today, where I emailed the engineer a couple of days ago and said, oh, do you mind sending me a version of this song with slightly less bus compression? I think maybe it'll... And he was like, yeah, absolutely. Sent it over. I spent about half an hour messing around with it, and then emailed him back and said, no, you're fine. It was good as it was, you know. That's great, because then I know that I'm achieving. My goal is to get the best for the client. And when that communication is there and we have the time to do those experiments, I know that I'm achieving the best that I can for them, you know. Whereas if there hadn't been time, then it would have gone out, and it was, I mean, as it turns out, it would have sounded as good as it could have sounded anyway, but I would never have known. And that's, you know, that's then me. because mastering engineers have this stuff as well, right? We want your music to sound as good as it possibly can.
Right.
And to do that, it needs to be a conversation, it needs to be a relationship, and just some time and some flexibility to achieve the best result.
Right. I mean, you want to, like, as the mastering engineer or any engineer working on, like, you're hopefully creating a portfolio that you can be proud of too. Right.
Yeah. I mean, there's nothing, I mean, that's what we find satisfying about it, is to be able to say, I mastered that. Listen, how, doesn't it sound amazing? We just on a pure business level, we want clients who are happy. We want to achieve a great result. I mean, that's people's, one of the classic questions. Well, what is mastering? And my shortest answer is make the music sound the best it can possibly be. Right. That's the goal. So, and whatever we need to do to achieve that.
Right. Totally. Very cool. Lidge is here. We're gonna let him in and say hi. He's ready. And there he is.
What's up, gang?
How are you?
Hey, Lidge, how you doing?
I'm doing good. That was kind of fun to just listen in and hear you guys chatting about all that stuff.
Yeah. I've never been backstage before. It's quite good.
It's a great green room, really good green room, except that it's actually white, but that's all right.
Yeah, good whiskey as well.
And then, exactly. I hope all of your riders have been accurately delivered. And
there were no brown M&Ms in the bowl, or maybe there was no red M&Ms. I can't remember.
Yeah. So we were just finishing up the second hour of EQ Day's Extravaganza live stream. Ian, it's been great to have you. You feel free to hang out longer if you want, but you also,
raise my camera.
Thank you. I would like to, but I think having got away with my voice this long, I'm going to go and drink the rest of the whiskey and collapse in a heap.
You do that. But I might have to have a old-fashioned in your honor later.
Sounds good. Thank you for having me. It's really enjoyed it, and congratulations on the EQ. Like I say, it's such a simple but such a clever idea. So I hope it's a big success for you.
Yeah, no, it's thank you so much. Thanks for taking the time to be here, and I'm glad you could you overcame your illness in time, because I'd hate for them to have to listen to me by myself for an hour. But
yeah, that would suck.
but yeah, no, thanks again a lot, and yeah, the EQ, I'm very proud of it, so I'm glad you like it.
Yeah,
sorry to distract your stage exit there with my goofy camera work.
It's always got to be about you, hasn't it?
It's always got to be about me. No, I bought this really clever little thing at B&H Photo once, and it's a collapsing stand, so it keeps collapsing as I was trying to tighten it.
All righty.
Jürgen, do I click a button to get out, or are you going to kick me?
No, I can kick you out.
Cool.
Don't we have a big hook?
Yeah.
Hook him off stage like that.
Yeah, right. All right. See you later.
Cheers, guys.
See you in.
Bye.
Cheers, Liz.
Dude.
Hello. What's up? Welcome, Lidge. How are you?
Good, man. So let me see here. Now I see the comments. Hey, everybody.
Yeah. We got
awesome to see everybody here.
We got over 100 people still hanging in here. Great to have a good audience. This is fun. I'm glad everybody's partaking in the celebration. And we're in our third hour now, and we're going to talk about, continue the topic of the day about EQ.
About EQ, yeah.
Yeah, but
you look like you're getting a good live stream tan there. You got a lot of color. It's great.
Yeah. We've been talking about EQ, but we've also just been talking about mixing in general. But for those that don't know you, can you give us a quick origin story?
Yeah, absolutely. So, hey, everybody, I am Lidge Shaw, and I'm joining you from my studio right here in East Nashville, Tennessee. It's a Grammy awarded recording studio that's actually a home studio in my backyard called the Toy Box Studio. And I recently remodeled the whole studio here too, working with a local designer, a guy named Carl Tatz, who put in an amazing speaker system called the Phantom Focus system. And it's a lot of fun for me to be mixing in here now and really have like a more accurate perspective of the sound of the mixes that I'm doing than I've ever had before. But I also have a podcast shamelessly self-promoting with the t-shirt right here, Recording Studio Rockstars. So it's a podcast that I've been doing for about 7 years now. And it's interviews with producers and engineers from both pro and home studios.
I've been on it 3 times.
And Bjorgvin's been on it 3 times. Yep.
Yeah.
It's awesome. And Ian's been on it.
Yep.
Ian was just here. And it's a lot of fun. And the goal of the show, of course, is to learn from recording professionals through conversations, the kind of stuff we'd like to talk about anyway, making records in the studio, so that you as a listener can make your best record ever and be a rock star of the studio yourself. Here's the little secret, though. I learned a ton over the last 7 years by doing all these interviews. And I feel like I've benefited massively from doing all these interviews and from just focusing on, you know, what it takes to make a great sounding record, what it takes to get a mix right, how to use things like EQ, compression, effects, how to not use those things, all that stuff. So that's just been a lot of fun for me. And, you know, it's sort of a perk of doing all the interviews and stuff.
I mean, you just sort of absorb all that information because you're talking to them and they're giving you your advice. You know, you're listening to your own podcast as you're making it, right?
Yeah, exactly. I didn't really set out for that to be the goal, but it's become more and more clear to me that I have benefited tremendously just from learning from all these guests who've been on the show, which is a lot of fun.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, so we're here just we're taking questions. We've been, you know, people in the audience have been asking questions. I also got a bunch pre-submitted. So you want to dive in?
Yeah, I do. So let me see. I see a bunch of names on here. Shout out to Paul Dewitt and Paul Lucas and Dayton Warner and Sincere Carter, Isabel, Tone, Eddie, Joran. So I don't know if I'm looking at all the right ones, but awesome to have you here. So thank you for joining us and being here right now.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah, I'd love to dive right in, and I'll start off by just saying congrats, man.
Thank you.
What you've done here is just totally awesome, and I love everything about you know, your ability to communicate with everybody and teach, and also to build just a super inspiring community of people who are out there making records. And then, you know, most of us sit around and we're like, oh man, it'd be so great to have a plugin for this or a plugin for that. So, you know, to see somebody just go out there and come up with an idea for a great plugin and make it happen, it's really, really inspiring. So that's awesome, dude.
Awesome. Thank you for saying that. That's great.
And, you know, I'll qualify that too. And I'll say I was describing to my girlfriend, Chrissy, who's not a record maker. She's a writer. But I was just, she's like, I know what a plugin is, you know. And I was telling her, but I was describing that it was an EQ, and I was like, you know, there's like all this techno babble that goes on with it. But when we talk about music, you know, we just use words that are descriptive, like you would if you were a writer.
Right.
And so Bjorgvin had this idea. He was like, you know what? Why don't I make a plugin where all the stuff you're messing with to try and make your music sound great is just a descriptive term? And she's like, oh my God, that's brilliant. So nicely done, man.
Thank you. Yeah, Chrissy's great. She's been fun to talk to. I helped her a little bit with her book writing, or book publishing more. I don't think she needs any help with the writing, but she had some questions about the publishing, which is fun to talk to.
That's right. Thanks for doing that.
Yeah. There's one question here that because you are the Recording Studio Rockstar, OG, there's a question here about recording that I wanted to maybe get your thoughts on. And so he says, Joe Teresi, he's a long-term customer of mine. So shout out, Joe. Thanks for hanging out. Thanks for submitting a question. He says, I have an isolated vocal booth as part of my home studio. I cannot see the person as I'm in the other room. I recently discovered that the vocalist is not singing directly into the mic as they look over to their phone to get the lyrics and those sorts of things, thus creating somewhat hollow and boxy sounding recordings on occasion. I sometimes have trouble trying to get these vocals to sound rich and full. It does help when I dip the EQ somewhere around 400 and 500 because that's where hollowness in the boxy frequency range is. Right there, as you can see. But are there any other tips for EQing these kinds of recordings? I still feel the vocals can sound better.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're doing the right thing when you hear a resonant tone in there that seems like it's doing the wrong thing. And, you know, the age-old technique of just saying, take a frequency, boost it, really max it out with a boost with a narrow bandwidth, and just sweep it around until you hear something stick out. And that can be an indicator that that's a good area to cut. So for example, if you're doing the 400, 500 and you boost it and then you find that frequency and it sounds like crap to you, then that means you really don't want a lot of it in the sound. So try cutting that and see if that helps. I think that's what I would do for sure. But I think that there are other aspects of tone that can help too, where sometimes it's not just simply cutting or boosting an EQ frequency. Sometimes it's, and of course the first line of defense, as I just saw Dayton put up a comment talking about using a different mic too, is just making sure you get it right. But Joe, I assume you're coming with the question of like, look, if this has already happened to it, how do I rescue the vocals? And so sometimes rescuing the vocals is sort of being bold and changing the tone a little bit, and going for something different, and doing things like compressing the vocals can really change the tone and change the character of it, and it can bring a lot of stuff forward and make the vocal sound exciting, where maybe you were focused on the EQ being the problem, but all of a sudden you get the vocal to sound exciting and you're like, oh, that thing that was really bugging me, I don't even care about it anymore because it's sounding so much cooler now. Using tape plugins can be great for that. I just did a mix where I took all the vocals that were sent to me and they were like all over the map with levels. And I sent them to a tape plugin. I did a cool trick where you take the bias and you crank it all the way up. So you over bias like crazy. And then you actually bring the record EQ all the way down, and then you start bringing the record EQ back up, and you just kind of sculpt the tone of the vocal off of the tape plugin, and the saturation and the compression and the limiting that's inherent in tape, it just does a cool thing and started to make the vocals sound really cool. And so stuff that might have bugged me EQ wise, I found I was just a whole lot more excited about, like this whole new sound for the vocal.
Right. Because sometimes you're not necessarily trying to be like creating something technically perfect. You're just going for a vibe.
Right.
Right.
Right. Now I'll give you a good tip that'll help you with your vocal booth. So to have a camera feed coming from the vocal booth to where you are that is high speed, so that there's no latency at all, that can be a little bit tricky. Although I've heard people say that inexpensive, like home security camera systems, if you get one on Amazon or somewhere like that, that has an actual wire from the camera to the system, that will be the highest speed with the least amount of latency. So you could do that, and you might find something for $100, $200 or something like that, that will let you see whoever's in the booth so that you can always see what they're doing. But the simplest, easiest solution is, if they're already going to have a phone in there, do a FaceTime call with them and just have the phone volume off, so that there's some kind of just, an extra phone or whatever, just have a video call going, and there'll be a little bit of a delay, but you can see ahead of time. You can see if they're not singing on the mic.
Right.
And then the last bit is, whenever I have somebody who's singing and getting lyrics on a lyric sheet, or they got a phone, is like, here's my microphone. I think you can see it right in front of me. If I have my phone over there, I'm going to sing off mic into the phone.
Right.
But if I put the phone right here, right behind the mic with a giant hand on the camera, then you can sort of force somebody to sing through the mic, and that can be helpful. Yeah. But bottom line is, the very best way to do vocals is memorize the lyrics.
Yeah.
Sing from the heart.
Definitely. I can't remember. This stuck with me for a really long time. I can't remember who said it, but they were like, they refused to record like people that had lyric sheets. They just made them memorize the lyrics, because you're technically doing two things at once. So like you're not code switching per se, but you are reading and singing at the same time, instead of just actually giving a performance, so definitely try to get them to memorize more. All right, let's see, is there any questions in here?
I'm just checking out the comments here and see if people jumped in. There's all kinds of stuff in here.
Is it just me, or does Björkman's addiction sometimes sound like he's been hit in the head? Well, if it's the internet, it's the internet, but it might just be because I'm foreign.
There you go. Or because you've been on a live stream all day long.
Yeah, exactly. All right.
That's great. Or because I took you to Bonnaroo those couple of times, and you never come back the same.
Actually, let's talk a little bit about that from from a workflow speed mixing perspective, right? So, and because we do a lot of prep work for Bonnaroo, so that you can record, mix, and master 3 songs live off the floor in an hour.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's tell that story for those that don't know.
Yes, sure. So Bonnaroo is a festival that happens about an hour south of Nashville, down in Manchester, Tennessee. And it's a 4-day music festival, 100,000 people there easily. And, everybody's camping and they're going from stage to stage. And then there's these big tent stages and just tons and tons of music going. And for 15 years, I was hired to create what's called the backstage studio. And on the first time I went down there, we were taking a look at the lay of the land and where the studio was going to be. And essentially behind the main stages, these huge stages, there's like an artist area where the artist lounges and the catering and the food and stuff like that. And they had a media area, a media compound as well. And they were using a trailer. So we had a double wide trailer, the kind of thing you'd see parked on a construction site where the offices are, that kind of thing, super generic. And so the question was like, how are we going to isolate this thing so that these huge stages, like how are you going to do a recording session when there's a giant stage going on right there? Right. So being that this was out on a farm, we had spotted that there were farmers, working the rest of the year. And somebody spotted that there was a big trailer that was just huge stacks of bales of hay. And so we were like, light bulb went off. And like that vocal booth that Joe was talking about, we thought, hey, why don't we just take all these hay bales and we'll stack them around the studio and build a huge encapsulated trailer and call it the hay bale studio. And so that's what we did. And that created this whole soundproof studio where you looked like a giant stack of hay bales with 2 doors coming out the side, right? And steps going up to them. Right. And so we would set up the whole studio inside there. And then that way, when the band would show up, they'd just come in one of those doors and we'd say, meet with them and just say, all right, what do you got? You got drums, bass, vocals, 2 guitars. Okay, you're there. And we'd have everything already set up with backline. All the instruments were ready to go. Occasionally somebody might bring an amp, but they're more likely to just bring in their guitar and their pedal board. And we'd set up the band like super quickly and have all the different microphones ready to go, feeding into the other little part of the office where we had like kind of a glass cutout. It's really just a piece of plexiglass. It wasn't really soundproofed between the 2 rooms, but we had a control room. And then I would set up a mixer in there with headphones going so that while the band's sound checking, it would be quiet enough in there and we'd have just enough isolation that as long as nobody got like insanely loud, you could still have a live vocal mic going, even though the drums were just across the room, but we'd have like blankets around the drums and everything.
Careful positioning of the mics.
Yeah. It was like everything was kind of as dead as possible.
Right.
And when we were working together, Björkman, I was in there mixing with headphones on and Björkman was out there with the musicians and he was like looking around, making sure that everybody was in the right place and the microphones weren't getting moved and everybody was set up and, had what they needed. Yeah. The musicians
sometimes forgetting to turn on the tube mics.
Sometimes did we do that? I forgot about that. Yeah, those finicky tube mics. They take
they have to warm up.
Yeah. Especially my U67 here in the studio. It can take like 15 minutes or something. Yeah. Like you turn it on and you're like, oh my God, it's broken. It's not working. And then right when you're about to give up, it's like, whoop, and there's the sound, and you're like, oh, never mind.
Yeah.
But we would set up everything so that it was all going through the mixer. and we'd sound check. And the beauty of doing it that way, of course, was when the new band came in, I still had the same kick track, snare track, overheads, things like that. And those EQs didn't have to change very much. They would change while the players are playing, but generally, you know, they'd start out from wherever the last band left off.
Right.
And so that really sped things up, and just being able to work super, super fast like that. And, you know, get the band hearing themselves, you know, pull up the faders and they hear themselves in the headphones, and that's what I hear. And that's actually the mix. And then it's just like, you know, all right, what's the name of the first song? And
Right.
start playing,
Yeah.
and I'm already mixing it, you know, down to 2-track.
Right. Right. And then that gets mastered as they leave, and then played on the radio, like maybe that night sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. All those songs were leaving the mastering. They're going into a folder, and then right outside the studio, they were picking them up, whether they're local radio stations. I mean, locally, they were at the festival, but they were DJs broadcasting to their home stations across the country and stuff.
Right. Yeah, it was cool.
Super fun. But some of the takeaways too, like, you know, as far as vocals, because that's always a challenge, especially for something like that. We used the classic SM7 constantly, you know.
Right.
That was a great choice, unless things got quieter. And then we'd break out the condenser mics for like acoustic and vocal stuff, because that really sounded awesome.
Right. And you'd have, you know, before, like the day before, we'd spend a lot of time sound checking and setting sort of like kind of like the presets for what we were expecting to get, right? And then, you know, you're setting up you were working on a big PreSonus live console, so you had a lot of like auxiliary buses and like return effects and stuff like that. You had that already set up so that you can work very fast on the fly, because what you're basically doing is you're live mixing. There's very little difference between that and sort of like a front of house live mixing engineer at the festival outside, right?
Yeah, exactly. And you know, for years I took an analog console there, and then finally near the end, in the final stretch, started to take the digital board,
right?
The Studio Live 64. And you know, it's funny because you talk about being able to work really quickly. Ironically, working on a digital board is slower, because I had to be a little bit more.
Your menu jumping all the time.
Yeah, my menu jumping. So I had to like develop a strategy where I would go over and I'd like bounce my fingers around. It was very musical. I'd like go over and I'd like touch my finger to where I think the move is that I'm going to make. Then I'd hit the button. Then I'd touch the console, and then I'd hit the next thing. And, you know, you kind of get into a routine, and that helped, you know, be able to make changes to stuff.
Right.
But, you know, with that, you know, we'd have set up, you know, the vocal mic, and then you had the EQ there, and then we'd have a compressor. But I mean, like, there's a question over here from Jack Shot Records. He's asking about using multiple EQs in a signal chain. And I definitely do that. So I would say that I'm not afraid at all to just keep adding stuff. Like if I hear something and I'm like, this needs a little bit to be removed here, I'll just throw another EQ on there and do some removing. And then, you know, a couple of plugins down the chain, if I'm like, ooh, I need to boost something here, I'll throw another one on and boost it again. Now, with that said, that leads down, you know, the garden path where all of a sudden you're like, you can also find yourself at a place where you're like, oh my God, why am I pulling my hair out about these vocals? And then you look at it and it's like, maybe it's because I've got 10 plugins on this sound, you know?
Yeah. They're also maybe contradicting each other when then you may need to go back. You know?
Yeah. It's a balancing act. You know, you gotta be fearless and unafraid to throw something on there and make a bold move if you think it needs it. But then you also need to be fearless to go back after you've done all this work. I don't care if you worked on it all day long. Go to that first plugin. If you're in Pro Tools, hit Control, click on that first one, and it disables all the plugins in the chain.
Right. And
then just listen again and be like, you know, was the original vocal actually better than what I just did after I did all this mixing tweaks, you know?
Right. Totally.
And sometimes it is, you know, and sometimes you got to go back to the drawing board. But, you know, as far as the multiple EQ, sometimes you need to, you know, one of the first things I like to have is a low cut. You know, that's like, and you see that's the first thing in the AI EQ is just the low cut right there. And you can select your roll off frequencies. And you can do like a really steep one and try and get rid of everything in the subs, or you can do a more gentle, shallow curve, which actually like a 6 dB per octave curve, which is really gentle, sloping, low cut, otherwise known as high pass, which of course is extremely talk about trying to solve confusion in making records. I mean, we start out with terms we have to learn where you're like, wait, which one is it? You know?
Right.
But at like a 6 dB per octave curve is really gentle. And that means you can actually move it like way up past where you're trying to cut. And it sounds right.
Right.
Because it's not actually cutting everything.
It's just a gentle cut there, but
yeah, like if you
not
took
an elimination, you know.
Exactly. If you did a 6 dB per octave and you were like, I want to lose things below 100 Hertz, you can find yourself moving it all the way up to 200 Hertz, you know, and it still sounds like you're hearing, like that's when you start to hear things disappear below 100, you know.
Right.
So I might do low cut stuff first because I want to control what's hitting everything else, or like, you know, just get rid of things I don't need. And then, you know, you might do a little bit of EQ before compression and then EQ after compression, and those sound different. And the best way I find to get to know that is just set up an EQ and a compressor, dial it in, and then as soon as you've dialed it in, take the EQ and scoot it over after the compressor and just listen and put it before and start to train your ear. It's like, oh, that sounds, you know, that's different.
Right.
I feel like generally speaking, I would say that an EQ before a compressor tends to be a little bit bitier and aggressive because it's affecting the compression. Whereas after the compressor, for some reason, to me, feels smoother sounding.
Right. And
I don't know if that's really a useful way to think about it, but that's how I kind of think about it.
Right. And it depends on what you're doing. So if you're, you know, but if you're cutting, if you're only cutting before the compression, it's going to affect the compressor differently. And then you're going to compress, but then you might want to add a frequency range to it. And then you might add a boost EQ afterwards. Like,
yeah.
And like, you know, hopefully in a few iterations of this EQ, I can put a compressor in the middle of these two EQs so that it, you know, becomes a pretty cool module of being able to have a compressor in between the cuts and the boosts.
Yeah. What are the compression buttons going to be called? Like squish and squeeze and
yeah, right.
Slam and mush.
Yeah, just a more knob, just more.
Yeah. What was I going to say about that? So I remember learning in school when they were explaining, you know, compression is preventing the voltage or the signal from, you know, from moving quickly. It's basically, it's, you know, if something was moving up quickly, it's moving up a little less quickly or whatever. And that can translate into frequency as well. So compression actually starts to squash down on high frequencies, which I think is why an overly compressed mix sounds just like a blanket is tossed on it. You know, I think that's one of the reasons. And compression can really highlight and bring out mid-range too, which, you know, I think sometimes we love that for rock mixes. We're trying to like the compressions, like we want more mid-range forwardness and excitement, but it can also be the reason why things start to add up and sound harsh and stuff. So those are good reasons why you might want to have an EQ after the compressor. Like you did the thing you wanted to do, but now the vocals are just too harsh and mid, you know, heavy. And so you may want to scoop them back out and stuff. Can I keep hitting questions right off the side there?
I just wanted to comment on this. Paul Lucas saying he wants this EQ. It's not like I don't have a ton already, but this looks interesting. Yes, I know that EQs are abundant. They're all over, and they come in your DAW as well. But hopefully, this will be the last EQ you need.
Nice. Well, I mean, I think to me it's obvious. It's great because the language really helps. I know that when I started out, I didn't, you know, other than, you know, you grow up with a car and you're like, okay, the treble is the high end, the bass is the low end, but that was kind of the extent of it. You know, it's like, excuse me, what's all the rest of this stuff, you know? And like when I'm hearing problems or I need more of something, you know, where do I want to go? What should I turn? I think it's really helpful to have stuff that, you know, just helps you understand where some of the stuff is, you know?
Yeah, totally.
Because we think of it like when you talk about an instrument, you don't talk about frequencies. You talk about like, man, that guitar, just like, it's so throaty. It's got a great chunk. It's so wooden sounding, you know?
Right. Yeah. You actually keep speaking English.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
You don't go into cycles and frequencies. There's a question here because you mentioned earlier that you have like a brand new monitoring system, the Phantom Focus, that you're super happy with. And I wanted to do you then need anything else for mixed translation? Does everything come out perfectly translated?
I still here, I at the risk of destroying everything with my camera collapsing again, I'll try and show you guys.
Yeah.
So this is my control room here, you know, got racks and stuff. And then that's my new speaker system. So this is the Carl Tatz Phantom Focus system. There you guys are. There's the Phantom Focus there. So they're near field monitors. And then in the bottom corners are subs. And then you see that right there. That's just an Avantone mix cube.
Yep.
And then in the back, you can kind of see over there, hopefully nothing's too messy, but there's a pair of Atom Audio T5Vs. And I use all of them. So I'm mixing on the Phantom Focus. Sorry if you had to look up my nostrils, everybody. I'm mixing on the Phantom Focus speakers and loving them. And I knew that was going to happen. Can you make an EQ? Can you make a camera that won't collapse next, Jordan? So I'm mixing on the big speakers and they sound amazing. And if I turn them up, they sound incredible. If I want them at just a normal volume, they sound incredible. If I'm sitting in the middle, like the depth of field and everything is three-dimensional and totally transparent. But also if I turn them down low, I can clearly hear what I'm doing at a low volume, which is exciting. But I'll still I'll even put these ones in mono and make decisions about stuff in mono. I still believe in that. I find that mixing in, yeah, thanks, Brian. Brian says I need a video EQ. So the, you know, I find mixing in mono is really helpful. The Avantone mix cube, I'll just switch, you know, I've got a mono button here on this guy right there. It's my, whoops, there you go. My speaker box, you know, you can just click that. And if you don't have a mono button on your speakers, you can just put it right into your DAW and then just take your left, right output of the mix. You'd probably have to go through a bus, but if you go through an aux channel, left, right, and then you just pan left and right into the center, now you're in mono. So if you want to check your mix that way, you could do that. And I think a lot of DAWs have a button now too.
Yeah.
But at the risk of digressing, I find that going to mono, going to a small speaker, turning it way down low, so that I have zero fanciness going on, and then just balancing all the instruments that way is hugely, hugely helpful and helps me get my mix right. So having a great speaker system means that, to me, it means that going for a very hi-fi sound I can do because I can hear a hi-fi sound. But as far as making sure that it sounds great on a lo-fi setup, you still have to listen to it on a lo-fi setup, you know. Right. I'll take it to the car and the car is still king, you know.
Yeah.
Even though that's a C and a K.
Yeah, that's I mean, that's just like the common advice is make sure that it passes the car test, right?
Yeah. And I think it's make sure it passes whatever the test is for you, you know?
Yeah, right.
So like, I mean, earbuds. One of the cool things, see if I can get it out of my pocket here. Just my little Apple earbuds, you know? It's like one of the cool things about these now and mixing is if I put these in my ears right now, my computer is going to go like, hey, do you want to listen through your earbuds?
Yeah.
And I could set it up to actually feed the DAW Pro Tools. Haven't done this in just a minute, but I'm pretty sure Pro Tools will still send it directly there, and mix straight to my earbuds. And then I can, know what that sounds like. And that can be really helpful. I remember it was actually Dave Pensado who first sort of brought that up on something I watched, where it was like the, that'll clue you into like, oh shoot, that stuff that I was panning hard right and hard left, it sounds kind of ridiculous in my earbuds. So maybe I need to, be a little more careful about panning and stuff like that.
Right. Yeah, and I always talk about, you want to, because when you're like a kind of an audiophile snob, I hear a lot of engineers like complain about earbuds and crappy phone speakers and all that. But if you're gonna do your job well, you kind of have to listen to the music as a consumer would listen to it.
Yeah,
because that's what they're gonna listen to it. They don't. Not everybody's an audiophile, right? The market's not that big, and so you need your mixes to sound great, well, as good as possible through the least quality speakers you can find, almost.
Yeah. So hey, here's another question. This is David Meshberg. I'm backing up just a little bit.
Yeah.
He asked, "What's your most used cue setting?" My answer to that is whatever the default was. Because seriously, I mean, like most of the time, if I'm using the SSL, which I actually have I'm not going to touch my camera again because it's going to fall apart. But I've got the SSL UC1 right here, which is the controller for the SSL channel strip 2 plugin, and those have 3 knobs. So you've got the frequency, the gain, and the cue on each one. And I always reach for the frequency and the gain first, and then I go for the cue for like that extra level of control. So that's my honest answer, David, is the default setting is the most used one. And when I feel like it needs to be adjusted, I adjust it. With that in mind, I think a good way to think about cue is a very sharp cue is you can get away with a very sharp cue when you're cutting and not notice it so much.
Yeah.
And you can get away with a very wide cue when you're boosting and not notice it as much. It sounds gentler.
Right.
But sometimes you need like a vocal, or you need a bass guitar or something like that, or you need a kick drum to cut through. You need something to have some aggressiveness to it and cut through, and that's where boosting with a high cue can really do the trick, because it's really going to feature a particular frequency and make it bite.
Because also, if you're boosting with a low cue or a wide bandwidth, you're boosting a lot of other frequencies around that, and that may get in the way of other elements of the mix. So like if you're trying to slot things into the mix a little more deliberately, you may need to narrow your cue in order to do that. Yeah.
And a good thing to remember too is that the basic elements of mixing, I'd say the first element is the mute button. So mute button, in other words, if you mute something, it's not there. So now all of a sudden there's nothing else to think about that particular sound. It's just not in the mix anymore. Right. So that's really powerful. The next level is the level. It's the fader. It's just saying, I'm not going to do anything to this sound. I'm just going to bring it up or down and decide how loud does this thing actually need to be in the song, in the mix, in this track. And then the next stage is EQ. And EQ, remember, EQ is nothing more than a selective version of the fader.
Right.
It's just bringing the fader up and down, but for certain frequencies and tones of that particular sound. So when you do a really broad band EQ, it's almost like going back to the fader, because if you broaden it so much, you're kind of bringing up almost the whole sound up and down,
Right.
And if you narrow it, then it's like you're just riding a fader on a very small portion of that sound.
Right. Yeah, totally. Question here I got submitted. Thought we might have some fun digging into it. This person says, finding it difficult to blend the bass, low end, and grungy guitars. When I get the guitars nice, the bass and the kick drum are too boomy, and when he overcompensates. So basically, like, how do you make sure all that low mid energy stays intact and stays separated and balanced?
Well, I think one thing that's helpful is to think of highs and lows in a couple of different contexts. So one one thing to think about when it comes to low frequencies versus high frequencies is, and how many divisions are there in an octave? Maybe that's a way to put it. I'm going to butcher the science here, but which is fine because we're calling things harsh and nasal and cheap anyway. That's the goal of this. Butcher the science, make your records great instead. So like when you go down, if you have 20 hertz is our lowest audible frequency technically, but 20 to 40 is the first octave, 40 to 80 the second octave. Brian Murphy, I see you in there, so jump in and correct me if I need any kind of science correction there. Science the shit out of me if you need to. Sorry, I don't know if we're allowed to swear on this.
That's fine.
But it's like those first octaves, the second octave, there's a lot less range of frequency in there than the difference between 10,000 kilohertz and 20,000 kilohertz, the highest octave in what we can hear. Although I don't hear a whole lot of that high octave anymore. I hear how it plays, how it blends with everything else. But if you played me like, I haven't put up a 12K tone, just a pure 12K recently, but it may be the 12K is already like at the max of an individual tone that I would hear. Definitely not going to hear a 16. Hadn't heard a 15 in a long time. So if you guys are all thinking about stuff like that, just know that it's normal that our high frequency, what we all hear, whether between individuals and then between ourselves from a young age to an old age, that changes anyway. But down in the lows, there's just, I like to think of it as there's just less room. There's less stuff to go around. And another way to think about it too is if you have a couple of different things that have low end in it and they're slightly out of sync with each other or they're slightly off from each other, that's going to cause a lot of stuff to happen, like phase cancellation if they're canceling each other. So low end can kind of come and go from what you're creating, as far as adding power to a mix or actually kind of killing it. And then if you think about, I was just doing a mix and I was listening, and in the back of the room, I was all excited about a bass I comped, and I went back to listen. I'm listening. I'm like, oh my God. I was like, why does it sound like crap down there right now? What's going on? And I started to realize there's a couple of things. One, I think it was a low B string on a bass guitar, which already you're getting into like some strangeness of growls and overtones and things like that, and maybe undertones. And then the kick, the fundamentals of the bass, we're getting down into the fundamentals of the kick range. And now I realize, the kick's sustaining. So it's actually got a fundamental note, whether I can immediately identify it or not. The speakers sure can, and the bass is also playing lows down in that range. And now if they're not perfectly in sync with each other, then they're slightly out, which means that it's actually the tuning's way out. It's like a little bit of tuning shift in the low frequency sounds like a lot of shift for the note. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So it really can make a kick and a bass that aren't working perfectly together can really sound out of tune from each other if they're both in the same range.
Right.
So that's one thing to think about. It's just, I like to think about the low end of a mix as very, very limited real estate.
Yeah.
And so if you can make decisions ahead of time as you're going into this, things like deciding that maybe your kick has the lowest of lows if you want it to,
right,
and the bass gets the next range of low frequencies, and then maybe the beater of the kick gets to make an appearance again above all that stuff.
Yeah.
And then above the bass is where the guitars start to get their low mids and stuff like that. But I'm not entirely sure what the question is. Is the question that the guitars were sounding killer, but now when you try and add the kick and bass,
it's kind of like getting like over like distorted guitars and bass in our, I mean, potentially a rock mix, a grunge mix, to sort of fit together.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess part of the question is, where do you start?
Right.
Know? And if you want to start by saying, I want to listen to everything at once, then start there and just have all your instruments up and start just balancing the faders against each other until it feels like a balance. And then maybe at that point, if you're thinking like, okay, well, how do I figure out what's fighting what? Maybe you can try the mute button. I find the mute button really, really helpful. So like at that point where you're like, everything's in the mix, but I could solo something, but I'm not sure, you've learned that lesson. Oh, like don't mix in solo. You're like, but how am I supposed to tell what's going on with the thing, So try the mute instead. So if you're listening and you're like, this sounds pretty good, but it sounds kind of junky, then mute a couple of instruments. Don't change your volume. Leave your volume where it is. Mute a couple of instruments and just listen. Mute them in and out, and try and identify like, okay, is it sounding killer when they're muted, but crappy when they're in? Okay, now maybe let me take those guitars and start using a low cut, a high pass filter on the guitars, and just moving it up and down through the range, and see if I can bring back what sounds killer about the bass and the drums by scooping out the bottom of the guitars. Or maybe you love the guitars and you want the guitars to just be massive, and you're like, how do I add the bass in? Maybe in that instance, your bass doesn't need to have the same fullness of frequency. Maybe your bass just needs to like have upper mids so that you're hearing like the driving power of it. And maybe it makes an appearance down in the very low lows, but maybe you're scooping like a whole bunch of, I don't know, 100 to 500 or something out of the bass because the guitars filled it all up. I think you just have to experiment with stuff like that. And I mean, we can get a whole lot deeper into like some bass tricks and stuff like that, but maybe we'll find out if that's starting to answer that question first.
Yeah. And the thing that I find very useful is when I'm trying to separate two instruments is like I boost and sweep on the instrument that I actually am looking to separate it away, but I'm listening for when it's really in the way of the other instrument. That's when I know that that's like where the competing frequency range is, and then usually it solves the problem when I just cut a little bit of that frequency range.
Yeah. Now, and another thing too is remembering the volume knob. So sometimes it's a lot easier to hear what's going on when you actually turn the speakers down. Right. When you have things cranked, it's a great way to make sure that your mix is crankable. I like doing rock and stuff like that, so I like to turn things up. I wish I could listen to them that loud for a lot longer. I can't now. I have to be a little more selective about how long I rock out. But there's definitely a place for turning things up loud because it's the music. We're trying to like listen to music that wants to be powerful, but you can only do that for so long. So that's one thing to consider. So you want to train yourself to mix at low volumes as much as possible. And the decisions, what we hear and the decisions we make about things are totally different at a loud volume than they are at a low volume. So for example, when we turn up a volume really loud, if we think something needs to be louder or softer, we're going to overshoot the loudness and overshoot the softness a whole lot more than what we hear at a low level. So if in science experiments where they're testing on hearing and the human hearing and stuff like that, they would find that at a loud volume, if you wanted to say that this sound is, twice as loud as this sound, you'd have to turn it up, 4 times or something like that. Whereas at a quiet volume, and again, this is where I get into the butchering the science, but at a quiet volume, you could hear that difference much more readily with a small move. So that means that, you make more careful decisions at a low volume than you do when you're turning it way up loud. Yeah.
Joe Gilder's here. He waves hi. Hi, Joe.
Joe, I got a microphone for you in the future, dude.
All right. One question I thought was interesting is some shelves produce a resonant peak in the opposite direction. Could you explain how to think about that and leverage it? Do you ever do you know what, like when it becomes kind of a tilt EQ in a way?
So tilt EQ or a resonance at the
Well, so if you're boosting, well, I guess I could.
yeah, I
I've
guess
never
there's all kinds of shapes, right? There's the one where it goes up and then it overshoots and then it does the that. And then there's the one where it doesn't it go and then it actually dips down and overshoots.
Yeah, so I've never shared my screen on this, but let's see if I can.
Yeah, and the good news is there's an easy answer for that.
So like Randall, are you
Yeah, there
talking
you
about
go.
something like
Yep.
that? So like
Yep.
when the Q, so this is just the slope or the high shelf here, and if you put the Q all the way here, then it cuts before it. So you can do this like that. I often do electric guitars like this because I like having that like kind of gritty 5K,
Nice.
3 to 5K sort of thing, and then especially if they're distorted, then they don't need all that hiss in the high end, right? Same thing here. You could technically boost the lows, but and then cutting sort of the mud that might otherwise be added. So if you see this curve right here, this curve right here. So now if I'm boosting at 100, right, I'm still boosting a ton of mud here, right? But if I increase the Q, I'm actually cutting the mud, and this is maybe a drastic boost, but so now I'm sort of preemptively making sure that it doesn't add a bunch of mud when I just want to add like thickness and low end, right?
Yeah. And I think, I think of that as sort of the Pultec trick too, where you'd look at that EQ and you're like, why is there a boost and a cut right next to each other? And I think that's, without seeing the graph, I think that's sort of the similar thinking where it's like you can boost the lows, but you're also cutting below that so that it's kind of boosting up and cutting down like that. And, so my easy answer for that, Randall, is the good news is don't think about it. Listen to it. Just like try both and listen. But if you want to think about it, I would say that when Björgvin was showing us the gentle slope, that's going to have a gentle boost and a gentle quality to the sound. And when he was showing us the dip sharp one, that's going to have a sharp, aggressive quality to it, Right. And I think you even kind of use that term a little bit when you're talking about treating the EQs on the electric guitar that way, right? Like you're getting rid of the high highs, but you're trying to get some bite,
right,
in that upper mid.
Yeah, like so another tip.
And I feel like I actually don't use that curve enough. So now I'm getting excited. Now I can't wait to try it out.
Right. So and one thing you want to think about, so the edge here is this is what I do with guitars to make them cut through. They just adding a few dBs here and then focusing it up, it's just going to give you sort of a boost like that, and it's going to help those guitars cut through really nicely, even if you need to take out some of the low end to give room to the bass and kick and all that.
Yeah. Did you guys consider? Did you consider having the graph on the EQ show your boost knobs?
I don't know if that would work, but that's definitely something that we're thinking about.
Yeah.
But it really depends on the limitations of the tech. If that is a thing.
Tech schmeck. Audio issues can do it.
But it does. It does. So if you put the frequency analyzer on, if you put it on post, the post analyzer is after both EQs, not just after the first one.
Yeah. By the way, everybody, I mean, maybe I should just, I call everybody in my audience the Rockstars.
You go for it.
All right. By the way, Rockstars, making a plugin is hard. It's hard to do. So
yeah,
it's real easy to be an armchair, this plugin ought to, this, that, and the other thing. It's a lot harder to make one.
Yeah.
So congrats on that, man.
Yeah. It took it was an idea for probably more than a few years, because I was always teaching this stuff. I was like, I wish I just had it on an EQ. And then it took another 2 years of development just to get it right. And, I was joking with our partners of like, well, when we started this project, I didn't even have a daughter. Now I have like a 16-month-old girl. So like, I thought that was pretty funny, like how much things changed in the time it took to take this to market, basically.
Yeah.
You know.
Let's see. We got some questions on there. There's one from DL Morris asking about a demo of the plugin. Don't worry about it, DL. Get this plugin comes with your what are all the things that it comes with? It's the book, it's the course. I mean, it's like it's so much more than just a plugin. This is like an entire mix training.
Well, yeah, it's just my hope is that you'll be like a master at the EQ spectrum after like reading the book. It's a 100-page reference ebook about EQ only. If you've read Step-by-Step Mixing talks about, the 5 most important plugins, in my opinion, EQ, compression, reverb, delay, saturation, goes through the mixing process. There's an EQ chapter in that book, but EQ strategies is as long as Step-by-Step Mixing, but it's only about EQ. So that's how in-depth that is. And then we created a brand new 12-part course on EQing using the concepts from the EQ strategies book, but in video format, but using the audio issues EQ, so that it's basically the ultimate user manual in that sense, because not only do you see how to use the plugin, you also learn how to use EQ in general, how to hear EQ, how to think about EQ and all that. So
yeah,
and
that's something that was a real takeaway from me getting to know you and seeing some of the stuff that you've done in the past. Is I was really impressed with the level of ability to just jump in and really like sculpt out an EQ. And I think maybe that comes just from your background. Like you really understand what it means to be recording and making records in home studios, and then, maybe doing the best we can capturing the sound, but really needing to make some good sculpting decisions when it came to mix. Yeah. And so, I was impressed with how fearless you were with your EQ in mixing. And I mean, that's a thing we hear, you hear about like the Chris Lord Alges of the world mixing, and they're like, and it's always like, oh, they were fearless. They turned the knob all the way up. Stuff like that.
You see videos of him like on an SSL just going like, just looking for that Muse bass tone just all the way,
Yeah.
So,
and I mean, I know you are somebody who really knows Logic, which has always had this graphical EQ interface, and your EQ is like that. It's like a familiar language for that, even though it actually uses words instead of numbers. So I think that's cool. So I think all that stuff really goes together, and I think this would be a great. I mean, I never had anything like this when I was learning how to record. We were just like looking at fancy stuff and thinking that that's what we needed.
Yeah,
nobody was really showing me how to EQ.
Right. Yeah, you got some frequency charts maybe. That was usually the go-to.
We had to do those stupid bubble charts. Oh God, I hated them even when I was in school. I'm like, I don't want to draw bubbles and pretend it's a band in a mix. Big circles and blimps and stuff, like this huge one. You're like the kick.
Right.
Like, I don't know what any of that means. What's the expression? They're like, that's like dancing about architecture.
Right. Yeah. And there's been some talk about Pultex in general. And that's actually, it's funny people talk about Pultex because the bottom EQ is definitely inspired by the Pultec EQs and the Waves V series, the Neve emulations. So a lot of the frequencies that are chosen and a lot of the modeling that went into the boost, the additive module is based on just my love for those analog EQs. So
that's great, man.
Yeah. Like I said, hopefully the last EQ you'll need to know for a while.
That's awesome. The first EQ and the last.
Yeah, well, hopefully I just know my audience well enough to know that they can't resist buying plugins, but hopefully this will help them more than just a standard EQ plugin.
Yeah. So just I'm backing up because I feel like I was missing questions that as the chat and the comments are going so quick.
Yeah.
But like another one from Jack Shot Records saying, you know, talking about this use your ears thing. How useful do you find an RTA, a real-time analyzer, is for visualizing EQ moves? I find it extremely useful. I don't use it to make judgment calls within my mix, but I use it all the time to train myself about what's something's doing. And I find it really helpful to do things like, you know, you're doing a low cut and you see the before and the after, like you do in the AI EQ, where you can cut lows and you can see, oh, I see all those frequencies now have gone away and now they're over here instead, or they're lower, or you can see the shape change. And I think it's really, really good for training ourselves to understand what's going on with things.
Yeah. Tone asked, does Audio Issues EQ have a dynamic EQ setting? Unfortunately, it does not. It's just the standard EQ, dynamic EQ, something that we did not include in this version.
That's more advanced stuff too. I think that could be, you know, that's a thing to learn later. I mean, I didn't have dynamic EQ for the first 30 years of making records.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see. Here's a good one. Randall says, I'm remodeling my home studio to be a car interior. That's actually not the first time that's happened. I don't remember who did it, but I've heard of people taking a car chassis and sticking it in a design for a studio so you can go like sit in it and listen to the mixes. But just bear in mind, you got to actually have the size and shape of the car, and the doors got to close, and probably need to have an engine running so you can tell which low end you're listening to.
Right. But yeah, we're at the 3-hour mark now, and we've been going through a lot of questions. We certainly didn't get them all, but I think that's also just great fodder for me later, and to answer those questions in future blog posts and videos. So thank you all for being here. Happy EQ Day to everyone. Please grab the Audio Issues EQ if you haven't already at audioissueseq.com. We do have a special discount promotion running until Thursday at midnight, so grab it today so you don't forget. And Lidge, thank you so much for being here. Special thanks to Chris Selim and Ian Shepard as well for manning the studio with me and fielding questions and overall having a blast. I enjoyed it. I loved seeing all you show up. Thank you so much for the questions. I'm very grateful for your support and for your time. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, dude. Thanks for having me, and thanks everybody for being here. You all rock.
Yeah. Well, let's end it at that. See you later.
Ciao.